Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of the Western Canon Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Alexander Hill, and today we're going to talk about philosophy and tragedy. Hello again, and welcome to the show. Got a great show for you today. In this episode, we're going to have Gina Santiago, our Western Canon correspondent, on the podcast, and we'll be talking about the philosophy of tragedy, specifically what Plato and Aristotle had to say. After that, we'll be speaking with best-selling author and executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute, Yaron Brook. He'll be joining us to discuss several topics, the foremost of which is, obviously, Ayn Rand and her philosophy, her approach to epistemology and ethics, and other topics. And Yaron will be talking about some of his own work, especially his book, Equal is Unfair. Yaron, in this episode, gives his thoughts on the inequality debate, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt, and specifically he talks at some length about how Objectivism, so Objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand, how Objectivism can combat groupthink and what I would call a dangerous intellectual monoculture that is currently suppressing thought and stymying debate at our modern universities. Speaking of philosophy and ethics, we'll end the episode with a new segment that I think listeners will enjoy called the Liberty Lounge. The Liberty Lounge is a new segment where we'll be reviewing great books that focus on the principles of liberty and freedom. And we're going to kick off the first Liberty Lounge segment by reviewing a fantastic book by Thomas G. West. He is a Hillsdale professor, and his book is called The Political Theory of the American Founding. And so what I'll do with that book is I'll break it into two parts, and we'll analyze the book over the course of 2 or 3 episodes. The next book after that will likely be Jonah Goldberg's Suicide of the West. Now, the idea here is to do older texts like John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and also newer ones like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. And that will yield for us, I think, both a broad and diverse conversation about liberty, freedom, and justice as we examine on this podcast the great ideas of the Western world. But now to my conversation with Gina Santiago. Gina is a PhD student in ancient Greek philosophy, and she serves as a regular correspondent on this show. I asked her to come on this episode to discuss how later philosophers like Plato and Aristotle thought about poetry and Greek tragedy. With that said, let's get her on. Hi, Gina. How goes it?
Good. Thanks for having me again. It's always fun when we record these segments, and you're doing such a great job with the show. It's amazing, and I've managed to get a couple of my friends to follow our Facebook page and listen to some of our episodes. So we're getting there in terms of popularity.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And thank you for your help on the social media, and just I appreciate that. It hasn't gone unnoticed, and so far, I think the podcast is going well. I do get a lot of feedback, and so one of the things I'm starting to think about is I put up a mailbox sort of thing, like a mailbag sort of thing, and I said, if people want to leave comments in the mailbag, that would be great. What it seems like people are doing is writing lots of personal letters to me, expressing, here's what I love about the show, and here's what I don't so much like about the show, and here's what I want you to do, and I got one angry alt-right person yelling at me for saying mean things about Trump, and but for the most part, beside that one guy, everyone's been really friendly. And so what I might do is just ask for their permission and just address some of the comments live or on the show in a segment or something like that. But other than that, we're getting a lot of views. More views on iTunes than even on YouTube, which we're getting a lot of views on YouTube. So it seems to be going well. I'm really happy with it. And I think that something like this, where you're working your way chronologically through the Western canon, your show increases in value every time you make an episode, in terms of it being worthy of following,
Yeah.
I know I would be hesitant to follow a show that had 2 episodes out, but I certainly, once you get up there, once there's some reliability and consistency, so we're gaining followers, we're gaining listeners, and it's just been a pleasure so far.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I know we're kind of behind schedule in terms of, what we wanted to cover at this point, but quality over quantity, and I think it's seems to be appreciated that we're taking, for especially you're taking your time to actually produce these episodes and like get interesting people to talk to and have different things going on in each episode. So, what is this, our fifth? Well, actually,
it might be our fifth
wrapping up the fifth
interview. It might be our fifth interview, but the next episode is episode number 7, and then quickly followed after that will probably be episode number 8. And so, that'll get us through the 1 year point. We'll have 8 or 9 episodes by the time it's been 1 year. So that ain't bad.
I think that's solid, actually, given the length of each episode and how much content you pack into them and all the work that goes into it. It sounds really, really fantastic.
Yeah, and I've been conflicted about that because I look at these advice columns and some people say, what you should do is you should do half-hour-long episodes, nothing too long, no one has any attention span, and you should do them every single week on the dot, on the hour. And my thing is I'm too busy to do that. I am going to read these books with loving care, and I'm going to put out the episodes when they come out. And I'm actually seeing that people are interested in the long form podcast. People actually, we underestimated their attention spans, and people are doing things like listening to Joe Rogan interview some random guest.
Interviews are 3 hours long, anywhere between 2 to 3 hours per episode.
Right.
And those of us who are podcast junkies, like most, especially me, a lot of the shows that I listen to, they tend to be episodes that are run anywhere from like 2 hours to 3 hours anyway. So and they've been around for several years, so I kind of understand why they would want us to be much more succinct, but I think there's definitely an audience for longer form podcasts.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's like if you're doing a podcast based on a very highly focused study of a work of literature, and then you do multiple segments and then you interview people, that's just going to go long, it's otherwise you just can't do it justice, and your coverage of Aeschylus and the Oresteia is, if you're going to cut that down to 40 minutes long, then that's just going to be the crude, superficial Spark Notes version. And what I think we're doing a nice job of is substance. I'm getting letters from students saying that they're using it to help them study and and stuff like that. And I'm getting messages from people who say, I just put it on in my car, older people, and then some people who like the fact that we engage with some of the politics of the campus if we get a chance. And so I'm getting lots of feedback, and one of the primary things that keeps getting repeated is how well everyone on the show is at explaining their ideas, and the one repeated request is to just keep getting good guests on and keep getting a variety of people that have different viewpoints. And so I think heterodoxy has been a really nice feature of this show.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're getting these comments. It's funny that you get that one negative comment from an alt-right person, because I think given the title of the podcast and the themes and what we're doing, and based on our own respective leanings, that we would actually get more heat or criticism from people who are sort of more on the left, I guess. I
did get a little bit, but it was very civil, and you can't even be mad at that. It's like, I would really appreciate it if one guy said, after we brought Mark Bauerlein on, he kind of in a knee-jerk fashion said, you got to bring on more people on the left. And I said, don't worry, they're coming, and but most people have been just really sweet, really civil, and really appreciative. Another common comment is, don't give up, keep making episodes, please keep this going. And so it's like, of course, I'm not going to stop doing this until it gets boring. So it hasn't gotten boring yet.
Or until we've exhausted every single piece of work in the Western canon. So,
and I'm
might take a lifetime
exactly
and beyond.
Exactly. So I want to talk with you today about Greek tragedy. Of course, we're working our way through this trilogy of episodes on the 3 Greek tragedians, and we're actually studying some of these tragedies. And I wanted to ask you, as a philosophy person and a classical philosophy person, I wanted to ask you about the views of Plato and Aristotle. Now, I have to admit that even after doing episodes on Aeschylus and Euripides and interviewing several different scholars who know everything there is to know about this stuff, I find myself wanting to go back to Plato and Aristotle, who are steeped in this tradition. And working sort of after and alongside this tradition. When I teach tragedy to my students, I talk about Aristotle's definition of tragedy. I give them that really brief, sort of old familiar definition that tragedy is a form of drama that excites the emotion of pity and fear, and that it presents a reversal of fortune, and it usually will be a noble person, a person of renowned and superior attainments, who will have some kind of fall, and after pity and fear have been aroused, there's catharsis. And I go through, all of the different aspects, and we talk about tragic flaw and hubris and all of that. That's really the extent of what I know and what I teach when it comes to Aristotle's views on tragic poetry. But what about Plato? If I remember correctly, Plato has a lot to say about poetry in the Republic. So let's first talk about Plato. What does Plato have to say about poetry, about poets, about tragedy? What do you have for me?
Oh, wow. Where do I begin? Okay, so overall, it seems like Plato had a very, very skeptical, and I'm being very, very, probably the most understated word I could use, very skeptical, critical view of the influence and salience of poetry in ancient Greek culture. If anything, we'll get into it in a few seconds when we get into the Republic, but he seemed very skeptical and wary of the effects of poetry on the souls and perspectives of the lay person in society. So, there's some nuance to it, I'm not suggesting that he's completely dismissive of it. If anything, the most accurate way to put it would be that he was wary and skeptical about the extent to which that, poetry was influential in ancient Greek culture, or the place that it held in the culture. There are a couple of specific reasons why Plato, or just to remember, it's Socrates. Actually, Socrates is the primary speaker in almost all of the dialogues, and he's the primary speaker in the Republic. And the Republic is where Plato most substantively discusses poetry in a very interesting way. And there's another dialogue, a very short one, in which he also expresses his critique of poetry, and that is an Ion. But I think the Republic is much more interesting. So, for example, books 2, 3, and 10 of the Republic are where he discusses the role of poetry in society. So the primary question in the Republic is the main question is, what is justice and what is the origin of justice?
Right.
And Socrates wants to, and I'm giving a very, very brief Cliff Note summary of that main argument in the Republic. Socrates wants to defend that view that just actions and justice should be pursued for their own sake. You should pursue justice regardless of the consequences, and regardless of the fact that in some cases you can get away with unjust acts and still reap the benefits. So basically, he wants to defend this very strong view of justice.
Right.
The problem that he has with poetry is what the poets tend to say, how they tend to portray the Greek gods. So basically, the way that poets describe the gods or portray the gods as these very capricious, inconsistent agents who have no problem inflicting bad fortune on good people. And Socrates is very problematic. He thinks that sends the wrong message. And it's not just the poets, it's that you have private individuals who seem to echo the views of the poets, in terms of how they view the gods. We're supposed to view the gods as a source of justice, a source of stability and consistency, but that's not how they're portrayed in a lot of the tragedies. And we're not just talking about the Greek tragedies. Socrates spends a lot of time talking about Homer as well. So he's including, when he's talking about poetry or the poets, he's not just talking about Aeschylus or Euripides, he's also, including Homer in this. And so he thinks that these kind of stories where we're depicting good people suffering and the gods, appearing to be responsible for the suffering, as sending the wrong message and having a very deleterious effect on the souls and values of the people in society, especially the young people, right? It's always about the children or the young people.
Right.
So he's very concerned about the educational effect of poetry on society, and the youth of Athens specifically.
Now, this is interesting to me, and my first reaction to this, number one, is it sounds a bit censorious, but having read The Republic quite a long time ago, that doesn't surprise me at all. It also sounds a bit what we would now call politically correct, right? The idea that we need to censor things and obscure the truth, or not talk about what was really written for the sake of possibly corrupting the youth. And the second thing that strikes me as interesting is that, Socrates was put to death for corrupting the youth, and so that's a very interesting thing that we have to deal with.
Right, and there's also this sort of higher, meta question of, well, are Plato's dialogues poetry? How are we... he didn't write any philosophical treatises, and all we have from him are these dialogues, which are arguably works of art and fiction. They're either reconstructions of conversations that may or may not have taken place. So it's very interesting. It's sort of like a separate, interesting question altogether. Yeah. So it's very interesting that you have Socrates entertaining the idea that we should absolutely aggressively, rigorously screen storytellers and supervise what they produce, because they are basically promoting views that are highly problematic. The idea that, there's no distinct advantage to being a just person because we see just good people suffering in these tragedies, and that's not the kind of world we want to have, and that's not the kind of world we want to portray and convey to the youth. It's very interesting. So the kind of poetry, it seems, that Socrates wants to promote is a kind of poetry or literature that would portray the gods as being immutable in their good, physical and character traits, moral characteristics. Poetry shouldn't convey any kind of falsehood whatsoever, and one of the falsehoods that it's promulgating is the idea that the gods can be capricious and morally inconsistent. And it's interesting because, again, he's also including Homer in this. In Book 3, he quotes Homer all over the place. And so, so obviously, Homer falls under his, his umbrella of critique. He wants the kind of poetry that shows that, it's impossible for gods to produce bad things, and obviously that would include, we don't want to see good people suffering. So the youth of Athens shouldn't grow up with stories where we see or hear about good people suffering, good, just people suffering. And it's also, in Book 3, he also has a few paragraphs devoted to, the different types of music that should be allowed. And he talks about different types of music and the kind of corresponding effects that they have on the soul, which is very interesting because we still, encounter those kind of discussions about popular culture and media these days about, media or these, artists who are not just enacting, but, portraying or conveying negative values.
Sure.
So it's quite interesting.
It's interesting, though, because at the same time, what's fascinating is that it is weird that Socrates would attempt to level his criticism at Homer's portrayal of the gods when, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what people knew of the gods was transmitted in and through Homer.
Yeah.
And so it is almost like, boy, I know this is a bit of a stretch, but it's almost like criticizing the Bible. Yeah,
it is. You know what? It's hard for us to think of it that way, but I think that's a good parallel. And in fact, that may have been the case. And again, going back to why Socrates was executed, he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and of being an atheist, but it seems like he was departing from sort of the Greek religious tradition and doing what he was doing.
Right.
So it's maybe it's entirely possible that Socrates, critiquing the poetic tradition, that he was seen as attacking their Bible, or basically their religious sources, their textual foundations of their moral system or their society or civilization as a whole.
Now, what about poets themselves? Did he have anything to say about the role of the poet or the role of poetry in general? What is poetry for? Do we get rid of it? Do we scrap it altogether?
Actually, no. In book 10, so like it's not like he discusses poetry for the duration of like all 10 books. In the Republic, he just revisits it. Like he introduces poetry or the role of the poets, or the problem that he has with poets in book 2, and he continues the discussion in book 3, and then he revisits it in the last book of the Republic, which is book 10. And he actually says at one point that the poets should be exiled for a period of time until they can, and they'll be allowed to come back once they decide to basically, change the content of their work, basically. So it's not like he thinks that, again, poetry should be extirpated altogether, that we shouldn't have any poets, but that they should be permitted to practice their craft, but in a way that dovetails with the kind of values that he thinks that the ideal city-state should have. And the other thing another critique that he levels against the poets, which I left out but is pretty important, is the idea that, poets are merely imitators of virtue, and he includes Homer in this. Like, Homer's poetry, he talks about warfare, city government, education, and he doesn't think, instead of like the poets themselves, Plato seems to have held the view that the poets themselves do not have a specific kind of craft or techne. Like, in the same way that being a doctor is a kind of techne, or that running a city is a techne, he doesn't think that the poets themselves that poetry itself is a respectable craft. Which is very interesting. Like, they're not interested in conveying truths, but just, replicating images or conveying images that may or may not be good for an individual soul.
So the idea of mimesis fits into here somewhere.
Yes, mimesis, yes. Right, and he thinks that, like, the poets themselves do not have any substantive kind of knowledge, right? He says at one point that, poets are imitators, and imitators neither have the knowledge or the right opinion about what things are actually good or bad, or, they don't have any knowledge or opinions about warfare, city government, or education, or anything else that is important for the functioning of society. This is quite, and I'm just giving an overview. I mean, he says great. More about it, but but that's what that's in book 10. He doesn't believe in, permanently exiling the poets. He thinks they have a role in society, but that their content or their art should be very closely monitored and censored.
So do the philosopher kings, are they the only ones who get to write poetry?
He actually doesn't ascribe that role to the philosopher kings at all. If anything, and at one point he says that philosopher kings are not the types of individuals who would be susceptible to the influences of poetry. He's concerned about everyone else in Callipolis, that ideal city-state, because they're not as solid as the philosopher kings in developing their rational capacities or having the kind of orientation towards the truth that that the philosopher kings have. It's quite interesting.
It sounds like you could just replace that word in modern times with populism or demagoguery or something like that. That only certain people are rational and self-aware enough and possess the requisite knowledge and the strength of will and character to resist demagoguery and populist emotional appeals.
Right, and again, it's not like he does seem to think that poets have a role in society as long as they have to make a convincing case that poetry is a valid form of education, and it doesn't seem that Socrates thinks they have a good case unless they basically change the content, the kind of content they produce.
So what would the proper content be? And I think this gets back to the values of a just city-state.
Right. What would that be? A very important sort of the governing, and I guess it's okay for me to give spoilers, but sort of the governing virtue of the city-state, like the primary virtue. So justice is being equated with moderation here. So justice and moderation, we translate that from the Greek word sophrozoune. So moderation is like the virtue that guides or governs like the city-state. I don't know if I should briefly revisit like the whole city-soul analogy, what Plato does in that, because I feel like I skipped that over.
You might do that. I'm pretty familiar with it, but maybe our listeners could benefit from hearing that.
Right, okay. All right, so very, very quickly. So again, what Socrates is doing is to make the case that justice is always and consistently advantageous. Mm-hmm. So an individual should pursue justice, regardless if he could potentially benefit from doing injustice in public or private. So in order to make his case...
That sounds anti-utilitarian.
It sounds very anti-utilitarian. So to make a convincing case, Socrates draws up an analogy between the individual and an ideal city-state. Now, very briefly, individual souls are made up of three parts, like the rational part, the appetitive part, and the middle part, which is kind of like the spirited part. And he develops an analogy of the ideal city-state, which consists of three classes, each of them corresponding to each of the three parts, like one of the three parts of the individual soul. So the case is basically making like, in order to have a properly functioning, city-state, it needs to have these features. Gotcha. It needs to be governed by virtue. The philosopher kings need to be in charge. We need to have this kind of education.
So they're the rational mind. The philosopher kings are the rational mind.
Yes.
Right?
And the soldiers, the military is like the spirited part, and everyone else, like the hoi polloi, is like the appetitive part. You make what you will of that. So he makes the case like, the city can't function without, having virtues, chiefly the virtue of, moderation, and the same can be said of the individual. Like, you cannot have a properly functioning individual without all three parts of the soul being in harmony, and the harmony is being primarily held together by this pursuit of moderation. So justice is basically the harmonious relationship between the three different parts of soul, and likewise, there's justice in a city-state if the three different classes are in harmony with one another, and that includes each member, the members of each class knowing their place in society.
Right. That sounds like that ties into his doctrine of the golden mean.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Moderation.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that if you read the Republic at face value, it sounds like Plato is giving a blueprint of some kind of utopian society, but really he's just trying to make a very, very colorful. Just giving you a very colorful illustration of what justice should look like, and then bringing it back to the macro level, like the individual and the corresponding parts of their soul, and why it's advantageous to be just or pursue justice no matter what, even if you could reap benefits from being an unjust person. And that is, and that's basically that's basically the city soul analogy. I was kind of all over the place explaining it, but it's excellent. One of the most compelling parts of the Republic. Yeah.
Yeah. And so poetry should in some sense reflect the virtues that the ideal city-state would encourage or foster, something like that?
Exactly. And his main critique is that the poets are not doing that. They're basically promulgating ideas and depictions that are in opposition to that kind of goal, right, to the proper functioning of a city-state. So given that the poets are, depicting very troublesome and quarrelsome human relationships, and they're depicting the gods in all sorts of ways, their form of education is not very helpful, or doesn't currently have a place in this ideal society. But, maybe if they change their art or what they're doing, the content of their work, then they have a role to play in the city-state. He doesn't say explicitly, but he basically said, they're exiled until they can make a convincing case that, poetry is a legitimate form of education, and obviously Socrates is not going to accept that, as long as they're producing the kind of work that they are.
Okay, now, does Aristotle deviate from Plato in this?
Yes. So we're going to Aristotle's Poetics. How do I describe the Poetics? So the Poetics is nowhere near as interesting of a read as a Republic. It's nowhere near as colorful. It's actually this kind of straight up, almost technical manual of epic poetry and tragedy. It's basically Aristotle's dramatic theory or theory of drama. And I would say that Aristotle arguably is a little more even-handed when he talks about poetry. Like, he's concerned about the moral content of poetry, but not to the same degree or not in the same way as Plato. He just kind of is very descriptive about it. Like, I don't think anywhere he says, like, oh, it's great that we have, like, this medium in society, and it's great because it, it's a great educational tool. Like, he doesn't, his comments about poetry don't go that far. It's a very, like, straightforward, in my view, like, description of what poetry is or what tragedy is. Right. Specifically.
You're right. It is very descriptive. Yeah. It almost reads like the kind of book that Harold Bloom or Stephen Greenblatt would have written 30 or 40 years ago, describing. I remember actually from reading parts of the Poetics that Aristotle did say something like the tragic hero can't be all good or all evil, but must be someone with whom the audience can identify, because if he or she is superior in some ways, the tragic pleasure is intensified, and that sort of thing. And things like the tragic heroes are elevated by rank or ability, and that makes their tragic fall all the more emotionally intense, or something like that.
Yeah, and I would think Aristotle adds to the discussion, and I don't think, I've just recently reread The Republic, and I don't think Plato talks about this, but Aristotle does talk about why poetry is so appealing to people. So he has his, like, theory of the origin of poetry, and what it basically comes down to is, like, human beings have this unique ability and unique appreciation for imitation. Again, going back to mimesis, and Aristotle doesn't quite give an explicit definition of mimesis, but he thinks it's the reason why human beings are drawn to poetry. He says we learn through imitation, and we like seeing certain aspects of our lives reflected through poetry or imitated in poetry.
Right, it's almost like a Piagetian constructivist claim, the idea that it can't be meaningful to us unless it has some grounding in real life, unless we can apply our background knowledge to our understanding so that we can get enjoyment out of it, something like that.
Yeah, something like that, right. So, like you were saying at the beginning when you're talking about how when you talk about Aristotle's Poetics, his definition of tragedy is basically, tragedy is basically an imitation of actions in life. It's not, like, really about the character per se, but about the kind of actions that we undertake and the sort of possible or inevitable consequences that ensue from our actions. Specifically, tragedy, and he says, is an imitation of an action that is admirable, and we can relate to that, and we experience this catharsis by watching these characters who are mostly admirable, like, suffer through these situations. And another interesting point that he makes is that, he, very briefly, has a couple sentences where he distinguishes poetry from, say, the discipline of history. Like, he says that the discipline of history is concerned with particulars. Like Alcibiades was this one person who did this specific thing, but that poetry is more universal. There's a certain universality to tragedy. It's not really about the individuals in the play. It's really about their actions and the consequences that come about from their actions. Right.
It's kind of like how the particulars bring about the universal. We still talk about that today. What makes a work of literature great? In some sense, it's the work's universality.
Right, so he wouldn't agree with the point that, tragedies are character portraits or something like that. No, he says that the central feature of a tragedy is the plot itself. And poets are makers of plots. And plots consist of, like, a series of actions that, that we can trace to certain possible outcomes or necessary outcomes. So it's very universal and broad, and it's supposed to be, and it appeals to us because, like, it imitates certain aspects of our lives. And again, there's also an emotive aspect, like you said, like, we feel pity and fear by watching certain characters suffer because we can relate to them on some level. Right. But it's not specifically about the character. It's not a character study, and it's not supposed to be a character study.
Right.
If anything, like, we can glean something, glean themes from, like, what happens to the characters and not without necessarily relating to them specifically.
If history is what actually has happened, then what is tragedy?
All right, so the other thing, so I guess to answer the question, I should, like, go back to what I said about why poetry is so appealing to people. And one of the things he says that we human beings derive pleasure from understanding or learning, and by viewing the most accurate possible images of objects, or viewing situations that play out a certain way, we derive certain kind of, like, it's a cognitive exercise, but we derive a certain satisfaction from that cognitive exercise of seeing certain actions play out, or, play out in terms of what we can expect to happen or what should necessarily happen. So it seems to me that what sets poetry apart from history is that we can more easily plug into poetry or Greek tragedies on an emotional level, whereas we can't do that with history.
Gotcha. So poetry is sculpted in some ways.
Right.
To appeal.
Like, it appeals to certain aspects of the human psychology that history doesn't.
Gotcha.
Or that it activates certain aspects of human psychology that it doesn't. It's interesting because allegedly the Poetics was actually supposed to be a 2-part book, and we only have the first part of it, and he only talks about epic poetry and tragedy. He doesn't talk about the other forms of poetry, like comedy. And again, because he's so descriptive, it's hard to see or say, like, where exactly he was going with this sort of work, or why he ended up writing it in the first place. Like with Plato or Socrates, we can understand why they spend quite a bit of time talking, or why Socrates spends quite a bit of time talking about poetry in the Republic, because he's concerned about, because poetry has such a prominent place in ancient Greek, Athenian culture, like, it's understandable why he would talk about it, because he's concerned about its effects. Sure. It doesn't seem to be the case that, we could say that Aristotle wrote a book about poetics precisely because it held such a prominent place in Athenian culture, but he didn't seem to have the same concerns about it that Plato did.
Do you think that's because Aristotle was a different type of philosopher, whereas Plato had this grand moral project and metaphysical project in some sense? And I know Aristotle's famous for his Nicomachean Ethics and all of this, but at the same time, he was a magnificent observer, right? He was great at observing the natural world and writing about what he saw.
Yeah, I would definitely say he's a very, very different philosopher from Plato. In fact, a lot of his writings are basically lecture notes. Like, it's not like he sat down and wrote Nicomachean Ethics or Politics. It's actually Nicomachean Ethics and Politics are actually compilations of, like, lecture notes that he gave to his students, which is very interesting. And I think he was primarily concerned with, like, describing the world as it is, and he had his own system of ethics and his own metaphysics, but he was trying to be somewhat historical too. Like, when he's talking about the metaphysics, he also gives you the metaphysical views of all these other preceding philosophers, like the pre-Socratics and Plato himself. Right. Whereas Plato doesn't do that. Like, Plato, first of all, did not write as far as we know, did not write a single philosophical treatise. All we have are dialogues, like, basically, arguably, works of fiction. And he has a very comprehensive metaphysical view, epistemology, and ethics, and moral philosophy, and sometimes it's hard to see exactly where can you draw the line between those different areas of his philosophy, so it kind of just melts together, whereas Aristotle is much more systematic.
Right.
I think and I think that's a different approach to doing philosophy, and I think it's as valuable. And I think at the very least, we get a somewhat more neutral approach to the Poetics from Aristotle than we do from Plato, because Plato's approach is much more morally inflected.
So I'm going to ask you an advice question. As you know, and I'm sure you're going to have some wonderful segment to contribute. Coming up, not this next episode, but one of the following episodes, we're going to do a 2-part set of episodes on the Republic, and what translation of the Republic would you suggest as a scholar? What I picked up was Alan Bloom's The Republic of Plato, which has a big, long introduction, and then there's a translation, and he's got all these notes, and then he ends it with an essay. So I got that because I teach a philosophy class, but the way that I teach Plato is in a kind of here are the ideas. So I know the major ideas, but because the course is so short and because we have to go through these ideas so quickly, what I have them do is read a couple of fragments, and then I teach the ideas a la the Socratic method and PowerPoint and the sort of rich conversation that we have. But they're snapshots of Plato's major ideas, the allegory of the cave and the tripartite theory of the personality and of the state and of Plato's views on education. And so I haven't really spent time close reading the Republic. What translation would you recommend, or if you have more than one to recommend?
The default translation that I use is by GMA Group, Grube. It's by Haidt Publishing. I basically use Haidt Publishing for all of Plato's dialogues. In fact, this volume that I have, The Complete Works of Plato, is by Haidt, and I recommend it because the translation is very, very clear and straightforward, and you do get decent introductions, like decent and succinct introductions to the dialogues and some like relevant footnotes. So I would strongly recommend the Haidt translation of the Republic.
Okay, great.
I do like Alan Bloom's specifically for like the very, very lengthy essay, but I would strongly recommend the Haidt translation of the Republic.
Sure.
And I would recommend Haidt for like any of the dialogues, like even Plato's Parmenides. The Haidt translation's great. So that's
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah, the translator that we just that we have on this episode is she publishes exclusively for Haidt, and so she does her all of her Euripides translations are through Haidt. They seem to take that stuff pretty seriously. So
yeah, they're really good when it comes to ancient works. The other one I like is Focus Publishing, but I don't think that they've published any like their own translation of Plato's Republic, surprisingly.
Okay, but just in general.
Yeah, just in general. So Haidt and Focus Publishing are great.
Okay.
And also, I just looked this up, and Focus Publishing does have a translation of the Republic, which I've never read. It's by Joe Sachs, and the thing about Joe Sachs is that he tries to remain as faithful to the Greek as possible, and there are advantages and disadvantages to that. It's faithful to the original Greek, but the disadvantage is that the English sentences read very awkwardly.
Gotcha.
And I have like his translation of like Aristotle's Metaphysics and a couple of other of his translations of Plato and Aristotle. So if you want to dare read his translation of Republic, I would.
It needs to be accessible for me.
Just based like on what I have from him, like he tries to remain as faithful to the Greek as possible, which
Okay.
can be like a headache to read sometimes because it doesn't, doesn't quite flow as nicely.
Yeah,
you try to remain literal.
I realized when I was, because I sampled and perused several different translations of the Odyssey, and I realized that when I was doing that, my favorite translation out of all of them, in the end, ended up being Fegel's, because I think what I appreciate, and I know that people disagree, but this is a universally loved translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad. And what I love about it is the fact that he makes it a theater in my mind. His prose is so beautiful and evocative, and he alters some things, but he's never doing so in a way that I feel is dishonest. So I was reading his translation right next to Lattimore's, Fitzgerald's, and Emily Wilson's, whom we had on the show. And I loved Emily Wilson's, and I really liked Lattimore, but I was able to escape into Fegel's, and Fegel's really rekindled that joy of reading. I didn't struggle through it. It came alive in my mind, and a lot of times I felt like he was translating at the paragraph level or even at the page level. but he was honestly trying to make the ideas and the story accessible. And I think that can actually be something to keep in mind when you're doing your translation.
Yeah, it's hard because there are definitely things that get lost in translation, but you have to make trade-offs no matter what. Like, whether you're translating Aristotle from Greek or Nietzsche from German, you're losing something in the translation.
Right.
And sometimes you have to decide if the content is important or the style is important. You just have to make trade-offs no matter what.
Yeah, speaking of Nietzsche, I got the Folio Society version, their publication of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I was all excited, and I opened it up, and it's great. I love it. I'm going to keep it forever. But they translate Ubermensch as Uber person.
Interesting.
Which I don't have a problem with at all. I just went, holy moly. Uber person.
Right. That's fine.
Super person.
Yeah, for Nietzsche, I think I always default to Walter Kaufmann's translations for some reason.
That's why I was shocked.
Of Tragedy and Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah.
I don't think I've read his Thus Spake Zarathustra translation, but I probably should at some point.
Well, what I have is the portable Nietzsche, I think I know what you're talking about. Edition. Yeah. So, okay, thank you very much for talking about Plato and Aristotle and their conflicting views and approaches to studying literature. It was excellent and very informative. Anything else you want to talk about?
I think it would be good to sort of talk about how their respective discussions of poetry could be relevant to us for today. It seems to me like we have a sort of philosophy of art and philosophy of media, which seems to tackle some of the same issues that Plato talked about. We still talk about sort of the negative or positive influences of various media on society or in education or what have you. So it seems like, it's not that Plato was onto something, but it's not like the kind of concerns we have about pop culture are new. It seems like those kind of concerns have been echoed, going all the way back to Plato, which I find very interesting, especially with censorship, because, censoring, there are definitely instances in which you have various regimes censoring, works of art and literature and movies. So it's not like
that's very much
this
true.
stuff is still very much
And I would say,
quite interesting. Yeah,
as teachers, a lot of times, and I've seen this repeatedly over and over again. You get censorship that comes from the left, and you get censorship that comes from the right, generally. And I'm speaking very abstractly and broadly about the ways in which historically works of literature on the curriculum are censored. On the right, you have a kind of Platonic ideal state form of censorship. I was at an AP training last week, and two of the teachers who were at this training were from Catholic schools, and the school censors on the basis of the works that promote a vision of life and society and religion that they view as immoral or unvirtuous or crude or corrupting of their notion of virtue. And so you get this, on the more conservative end, you typically get this book is immoral, this book is going to corrupt the minds of the youth. And on the left, and I know this from working in public schools, in the more secular, liberal public school end of things, the calls for censorship are almost always instances of racism, instances of sexism. Well, the N word is used in Huck Finn, therefore our children can't read that book, even though it's a supremely anti-racist book, even though it's an aesthetic masterpiece that an American anti-racist classic about universal dignity and the sovereignty of the individual and everything that we have in common. Because there are people in that book who are racist, that is a work that cannot be read. And even at our school, apparently a few years back, there were calls to ban To Kill a Mockingbird. And And so on the left, it has to do with a kind of purity of language, and things like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, like, I mean, just bringing it back to Plato again, we just have to remember that he wasn't exactly giving us a straight-up blueprint of an ideal society.
Sure.
He was just talking about, like, the individual soul writ large. And it's interesting because, at the very least, if you want to approach it in a more nuanced way, we can, at least Plato gets us to think about and leave it up to us to determine or be more discerning about how various types of literature or media or movies or music have an effect on us or shape our way of thinking. I mean, like, that would be probably one point of agreement with Plato. Like, works of art do have a profound effect on us.
Absolutely.
Obviously, where I would disagree with him and other calls for censorship is that they basically assume that the average person is not discerning enough to know that the N-word is derogatory and you just can't throw it around, or that just because you see a commercial, like a cereal commercial featuring gay parents, that, it's not necessarily going to affect your own family dynamics.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, like, you can kind of understand where these censorship concerns with censorship are coming from, but you could still say, we should still allow people to have unlimited, unrestricted access to these media, but we could still be more discerning about what we decide on our computer screens or on our smartphones or what we listen to.
Plato would probably disagree with you, however, when it comes to the faith that he places in individuals' ability to reason well in all matters. Right. And, he had a kind of disdain for democracy. And, I often wonder, not to trivialize or cheapen our conversation, I often wonder what Plato would think of a populace that could elect a person like Trump into office. Yeah,
it would be very interesting. So there have been a couple of think pieces that actually talk about what would Plato would say about Trump's election, or what would Aristotle say. There have been a few that I've saved, and I can't remember any of the titles, but there are definitely people who beat us to it. It's interesting because basically, he probably would say something like, this is what happens when you allow media that appeals to the appetitive part of the soul and, work at people,
exactly.
appealing to the wrong parts of the soul, and therefore, we get someone who's far from a philosopher king as we could ever imagine.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. This is just, my own sort of... something like that. It's not quite an informed, carefully thought out view, but I would imagine that he would be more critical about the type of leadership than in favor of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so these works continue to have relevance for us today, and as I go into teaching my philosophy course this year, I'm going to think about the comparison that you've made in terms of censorship and in terms of how we think about the role that media plays in shaping our tastes and shaping our judgments and shaping our behavior and in shaping our political consciousness. And so I think that will be an interesting question to pose, maybe a journal reflection.
Right, and also, Plato basically says there's this, long-standing quarrel between, philosophy and poetry, and in some sense we could say there's a quarrel between, truth and media, different forms of media. I don't know.
Yeah.
Arguably.
Fake news.
Yeah, and also, and it's interesting because, a substantial portion of the Republic also talks about, a formal education system, so there's also sort of a general theme of, well, what constitutes a legitimate form of education? There's education that's outside of the formal education system, not just higher education, not just kindergarten to high school, but arguably, there are other elements of society that have as much of an educational effect or impact as being in school does. So I think Plato's also relevant in that sense, because for him, he thinks that he didn't think that the poets were fit educators, or they were not fit to serve as mediums of education or media of education.
Right.
So there's also not just censorship, it's also what is education and
True.
What is, if there's such thing as legitimate education.
Right.
And what should constitute this education.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's also another important part of it too.
That's great. I mean, I love that comparison, the idea that this is also relevant to the questions that we ask of our teachers.
Right.
When is a teacher, we want teachers to teach students how to think and not what to think, and when is a teacher doing that, and where's the line, and what are the sorts of things that should be taught if critical thinking is being emphasized, and what is the teacher's telos?
Right.
So.
Right. It's funny because Socrates, arguably didn't go around trying to, impart knowledge to anyone. He was actually trying to help people learn how to think well. But here he is in the Republic, literally drawing up an education system that teaches certain segments of the population what to think. Right.
That's interesting. That's so interesting, because I picture Socrates as the big, fat, ugly, but very wise and knowledgeable man of the people, walking around the city of Athens and questioning people about their beliefs. And instead of taking the offensive and telling people what they should believe, he would ask questions and use the Socratic method, and reductio ad absurdum was, finding out what people believe, assuming that what they believe is true, and then drawing absurd logical conclusions out of that. And that is the teacher's telos. If you're an English teacher, if you're a philosophy teacher, you're not ramming your beliefs or your opinions down students' throats. You are reading texts closely, you're raising questions, and you're teaching students how to think critically, and you're pushing them to think critically, and you're asking for evidence and sound. You're asking them to make sound claims and to exhibit valid reasoning, and use evidence to support and substantiate claims and things like this. And that does seem to be what Socrates was doing, and I like to think of the Republic as a kind of thought experiment, as a kind of fun
right, which is why I keep saying okay, just keep in mind that we're not supposed to read this city soul analogy on face value, because you have to look at what he does carefully. He's basically he's just using the analogy in service of a broader point, not saying this is what the ideal society should look like, and we should it's very tempting to read it that way, but that's not what he's doing.
Absolutely.
I read it primarily as a work on moral philosophy and ethics, and not as a political philosophy book. I think it would be a misreading to categorize it as a political philosophy book or political theory book.
Right.
That's just me.
What would my philosophy look like if we put it into practice? So. Right.
Yeah. There's another question as to why he decided to do that, come up with this very elaborate, lengthy analogy, but that's a question for another time, I guess.
Hey, we all do that in our heads. He just wrote it down.
Right, yeah.
So, excellent. Very, very fascinating questions raised. I think this is one of our best segments yet. I really appreciate you coming on to talk about Aristotle and Plato's views on poetry and art and the role of the philosopher and the Republic. I'm hoping that when you come on to talk about the Republic in some greater depth, when we actually do 2 episodes on the Republic, I'm hoping you'll come on for one of those episodes and do a whole new segment. And maybe when I've studied up on this book and I've close read the Republic, maybe I can be a more intelligent interlocutor for you, and maybe we can talk about something where we're really trying to understand the ideas in the Republic, and I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that discussion as well.
Come up with some ideas.
Yes, I will. Actually, there are a few churning in my head right now, and you're a more than adequate interlocutor for me, so don't worry about it.
I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be great. And you know what? Before we do that, we'll also do an episode on the pre-Socratics. And so, if you want to pick a philosopher to talk about, maybe we could bring you in for an interview, and maybe you could talk about, whomever is your Heraclitus or Anaximenes or Thales or whatever.
They're also very interesting because those are philosophers who wrote poetry. They conveyed their philosophy through poetry and fragments. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. Excellent. So thank you again, and I wish you luck in your endeavors. I hope you're able to see the light at the end of the tunnel here with your dissertation.
Me too. I'll need all the luck I can get. All right. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, so that was fantastic. Speaking of Plato, we're going to be doing our next 3 episodes on Plato, so look out for those episodes. We'll do an episode with Spencer Clavin first that will be focused on Plato's influence on Christianity and Western thought, and then we'll be doing 2 more episodes specifically on Plato's Republic, and so we'll do 2 full episodes analyzing all of the ideas in Plato's Republic and sort of walking through that story. And for those 2 episodes, we'll be having on at least one well-known Hillsdale College professor and other guests as well. I will announce who those guests will be in the next episode. And now, to continue this episode's theme of philosophy, let's move on to Professor Yaron Brook. Yaron Brook is an Israeli-American entrepreneur, writer, and activist. He's an objectivist and the current chairman of the board at the Ayn Rand Institute, where he's been executive director since 2000. After graduating high school, Yaron served as the first sergeant in the Israeli military intelligence from 1979 to 1982. He then earned a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering in 1986 from the Technion Israeli Institute of Technology in Haifa. In 1987, he moved to the U.S., where he received his Master of Business Administration in 1989 and his Doctor of Philosophy in Finance in 1994 from the University of Texas at Austin. For 7 years, Dr. Brook held a post as finance professor at the Levy School of Business at Santa Clara University. In 1998, he co-founded the financial advisory firm BH Equity Research, where he continues today as a managing director and chairman. Dr. Brook is a columnist for Forbes, and his articles have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Investors, Business Daily, and many other outlets. A frequent guest on a variety of radio and national television programs, he is the author of Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government. That's Macmillan, 2012. Equal is Unfair. That's another one of his books. Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality. That is St. Martin's Press, 2016. And his other book that just came out recently, In Pursuit of Wealth, The Moral Case for Finance. That one was actually published by the Ayn Rand Institute Press in 2017. So let's get him on. Hi, Dr. Brook. Thanks for joining the Western Canon Podcast.
Hey, Jordan. It's good to be here.
Excellent. So I want to start by asking you a question that I posed to the philosopher Stephen Hicks when he was on this podcast. Stephen is an academic philosopher. He's also an objectivist. You probably know about him, sure. Which I would argue makes Stephen an extremely rare breed in academia. That is because Ayn Rand has been ostracized from the modern academy. She's not regularly discussed in philosophy programs. There are no objectivism courses being taught at any mainstream universities, or at least none that I'm aware of. If you do mention Ayn Rand's work in a philosophy class at a mainstream university, you get laughed at or told that you're juvenile. The common response I've heard is, well, I used to read her when I was a teenager.
Sure.
And I would know this because I majored in philosophy. And to me, I would say that this is extremely odd. Ayn Rand's work is still widely read today. Her books fly off the shelves. Mainstream politicians and actors and titans of industry and artists credit her as being an inspiration and a genius. And you probably could even argue that she's the single most influential and widely read woman philosopher in history. She created her own comprehensive, internally consistent philosophical system. Everyone I've ever talked to has read at least one of her books. And so my question is, why has Ayn Rand been so unfairly maligned in modern scholarship? Why is she seen as taboo? What is it about her philosophy that draws the ire of so many in the so-called intellectual elite?
Well, it's a big question. I mean, so recently there was an article actually published in Aeon, I think it's Aeon magazine, which is kind of a popularized magazine for philosophers. And it was from a well-known female philosopher who said, we need to stop paying attention to Ayn Rand in academia. And she gave exactly what you just said. You know, Ayn Rand's incredibly influential. Our students read her. She has more impact on our students than anybody else we're going to teach. And while she then went on to badmouth Ayn Rand and to distort and pervert her philosophy, she said, we've got to start taking her seriously. So maybe academia is waking up to exactly this issue. I'd also say that I don't want to overstate it. There are some people who do teach Ayn Rand. I mean, certainly there's some objectivists at some pretty prominent universities, from Darrell Wright at Claremont Colleges. Tara Smith has a chair in the philosophy of objectivism at the University of Texas in Austin, a top 20 philosophy department. And Greg Salameri actually teaches at Rutgers University, which is the top philosophy department in the world, at least some years, depending on the survey. So we do have some presence in some top universities. I don't want to be too pessimistic about where we are. But yes, I mean, generally she is shunned. It takes somebody to write in Aeon magazine. We need to take her more seriously. And I think hopefully, and I think they are starting to take her more seriously. But I think the reason is she wasn't an academic, is one, right? She didn't speak their language. She didn't do philosophy based on how in the 20th century academic philosophers did it in a particularly stylized, particularly obtuse way. And she wasn't part of the club. And it's important to be part of the club, I think, for the philosophers, for people inside the club. They don't like outsiders. But of course, it's deeper than that. I think the real reason, although I think that's part of it, the real reason is that she challenges so much of conventional philosophy, and she approaches it from a completely different, fresh, new perspective. So it's not just that the content of her philosophy is different. Her methodology is different. So her whole approach to epistemology, and as a consequence, the whole way in which she presents the objectivist philosophy is different. So she really is much more Greek than she is modern. But they don't know how to fit her in because she's not 2,000 years old. They can kind of tolerate that because that's old. But she doesn't fit into a post-Christian, post-Kant era of philosophy, both because of the way she presents the ideas, and then of course the content turns everything upside down, right? Philosophy, to some extent or another, has been dominated by some form of, primacy of consciousness or a rejection of reality as it is, since Kant, maybe even since Descartes to some extent. It's very suspicious of reason. Reason, as Ayn Rand understood it, of course, Ayn Rand understands reason in a completely different way than academic philosophers talk about reason. They talk about reason as a Kantian kind of thing. In a sense, something happens inside your mind that is not that related to actual reality. So her understanding of reason is much more Enlightenment related, but the Enlightenment is kind of out, and it's not quite the Enlightenment because she is more refined than the Enlightenment, so it's more Aristotelian. And then, of course, in ethics, she completely overturns. She says there is no dichotomy between is and ought, and which academics don't even know how to think about because of the way they think about reason and the way they think about reality. And then she's a rational egoist, which overturns 2,000 years of one way or another altruistic philosophy, altruistic ethics. And of course, ultimately, she is as a consequence of all that, a radical for capitalism in a world where most academics, never mind most philosophers, are quite left and quite suspicious of anybody who is pro-markets. I think even academic philosopher who did all the things but landed up being pro-capitalism at the end of the day, they would look suspiciously on them because politics, partially the problem is that they've convinced themselves that politics is everything. I think this maybe comes out of English and the postmodernism and so on, that everything is political. There's nothing in life that's not driven by politics. And therefore, maybe the postmodernists don't quite have that big an effect on philosophy departments, but they have some. Certainly, personally, so many of these people can't think of philosophy separated from politics. So I think for all those reasons, and again, her methodology, which is English, right? She speaks in complete English sentences and comprehensible ones.
Right, clarity. She values clarity.
In a respectful way. Nobody writes like that, right? In academic philosophy, at least. And although, they do respect, they seem to respect somewhat Sartre and Camus and the existentialists who wrote in plain language. But I think it's because they were conventional at the end of the day. Philosophically, they weren't revolutionaries.
But even the existentialists are out now. They're out, and I think a big part of that is that they talk a lot about freedom and responsibility, and so they're out.
Yes, and I don't know how big they were in philosophy ever. I just don't know. They seem to have impacted other fields in the humanities much more than they impacted philosophy itself. So
you mentioned her free market, pro-capitalism approach. Stephen Hicks also identified that. He said she's a firebrand, and she has her own political philosophy, and she's something of a libertarian. So politically speaking, why do so many... I know. I was just going to say that. Why do so many objectivists typically refrain from identifying themselves as libertarians? Because I would think a bigger tent for objectivists would help, right? Not to use the language of the left, but a more inclusive language from objectivists might help the cause. But
if we believe that the cause is philosophical, not political, that ultimately the cause is convincing people about the morality of self-interest, and the cause is convincing people epistemology of reason, then a big tent doesn't help, because it kind of blurs those distinctions, and it doesn't make clear what it is we actually stand for. So Ayn Rand was very clear. She stood for capitalism because she stood for egoism. She stood for egoism because she stood for reason. For her epistemology and her ethics are the core of her philosophy. The politics is just a logical outcome of all of that. The problem with libertarianism as an ism is that it is a big tent. And it's a big tent with some people who were sympathetic, maybe, right? It's true that politically and from political economy perspective we agree, and they might even sometimes flirt with some of our philosophical ideas. So we have some allies within this big tent. But we also have some real enemies. I mean, real enemies, not marginal enemies. We have Kantians. Ayn Rand called Kant the most evil person in history because of how she viewed his philosophy and how destructive she believed his philosophy was to the 20th century. And so if you're agreeing, yeah, we agree in free markets, but you guys pretend to come to free markets from the perspective of the most evil philosophy in human history, according to Ayn Rand, we're not allies, right? We're not allies philosophically. Or you have anarchists who are, for the most part, moral subjectivists and philosophical subjectivists and relativists. Well, that again, we consider philosophically incredibly harmful and destructive for the cause of reason. So how can we be in the same tent with them when their fundamental ideas are so destructive to what we're trying to do? So if you believe, as I do, as Ayn Rand certainly did, that the only way to truly get to free markets, the only way to win the political battle, is to win a deeper philosophical battle, then there is no tent, right? Then in some ways we have tents with other people, right? So I respect people who are advocates for reason, even if they happen to fall politically on the left, because I think that ultimately, if they're consistent advocates of reason, then free markets is obvious. It doesn't work the other way around necessarily. It doesn't seem to work the other way around. So I am very hesitant to have a tent with anybody. If I have a tent, it's a short-term tent.
That's very objectivist of you. That's very Ayn Randian of you.
Yeah, I mean, because if you take ideas seriously, I don't think it's Ayn Randian as much as it is taking ideas seriously. I'm willing to sit down with Steven Pinker and talk about the Enlightenment and talk about reason and the importance of reason. I don't think he understands reason right, and I'd like to talk to him about that, or I'd like somebody to talk to him about that and see if we can fix that, because I think it's destructive. I like to talk to, I don't know, Dave Rubin or even Sam Harris about free speech and about certain issues in philosophy. I like to talk to George Selgin and Larry White and Pete Betke, who are libertarian economists, about economics and some of them I can go deeper with, and they'll accept some of the deeper stuff. But then they go to, some of them might go to anarchy, or some of them might go to more subjectivism. So for on every issue, I think it's important for us to clearly define what we agree on and what we disagree on. And when you do that, I think there are very few tenets. I think even libertarians who are not objectivists have a problem with big tents. I mean, I don't want to speak to everybody, but there's some economists I know who are libertarians technically who don't like the term because they don't want to be associated with some crazy, anarchists, who call themselves socialist anarchists or whatever, who are part of this libertarian tent. They don't want that association. And they just say, look, we're just free market economists. We're just good economists. And that's what we do. And we don't need these labels and these big tents. So I don't think it's uniquely objectivist. I really do think the tent idea is problematic for anybody who takes their own ideas seriously.
So you mentioned Dave Rubin and Steven Pinker and Sam Harris. How about Jordan Peterson?
So, Jordan, I think, is problematic. Again, I think there's certain issues where we align and where there's interesting things, certainly on free speech. I think all of these people, kind of the intellectual dark web, it's being called today, the thing they share is a respect for free speech. And I respect them for respecting free speech because I can't think of a more important issue in the world right now than free speech. And one of the things that saddens me is how many on the right seem to confuse free speech and don't understand what free speech. So they claim Facebook is censoring as if Facebook has a gun. But so I respect them and I want to work with them to promote free speech. The other thing I respect about Jordan Peterson and the others is their willingness to talk to people who they disagree with. So their willingness to actually engage in a conversation, not a fist fight or not a dismissive kind of. While I think it's important for objectivists not to be in a tent with Jordan Peterson, but to clearly identify the differences, and the differences are deep, the differences are substantial, whether it's in ethics, whether it's certainly in epistemology and metaphysics, the differences are as big as they get. He's a Kantian epistemologically, and I think a Kantian ultimately metaphysically. And he's got the same kind of motivations, and he's a mystic in some respects. But I think he claims to not to like the postmodernists, but he sounds a lot like them sometimes. So all of that is true, but he's willing to engage in a conversation, and he's willing to have a conversation about deep, important ideas, and his fans are willing to listen to a conversation about deep, important ideas. Where do you get a person who can attract 250,000 people to listen to a 2-hour conversation on epistemology? It just doesn't happen. So I'll take that opportunity every day. If you give it to me to have a discussion, I wouldn't do it because I don't know epistemology well enough. But to give to an objectivist epistemologist the opportunity to discuss with Jordan Peterson epistemology, when he can bring that kind of audience to the table, hopefully we can have an influence on them.
So you mentioned Kant, and you mentioned Ayn Rand's aversion to Kant, and you mentioned how Kant is problematic in a way, and how Jordan Peterson, you claim, is a Kantian in terms of his epistemology. So let me ask you, what do objectivists find problematic about Kant? Because, and I'll preface this, I majored in philosophy, and obviously Descartes, Hume, Kant, Berkeley, the modern philosophers were inspirational to me. I'm surprised at this disdain for Kant, because Kant, in the end, believes that it's the formulating categories of our mind that shape the experiences, that shape the world the way that we see it. But Kant does believe in the objective world. He does believe that there are objects out there, that there are things in themselves, that we can't experience them directly, but they're there, and we have this imperfect filter. That's a good question.
The problem is he doesn't know that. He can state that. He can say whatever he wants, and that's why his followers ultimately doubt the existence of things out there. They doubt the existence of reality
out there. That's a great point.
He can't prove it, right? So let me preface this, right? I am not a philosopher, so I'm not an expert on this. You'll have to have Greg Salamiri, Jon Kagate, or
anytime.
Harry Bitz somebody who is a real philosopher and who understands Kant deeply. So I'll give you my understanding of Kant, which is not complete and not full. But that's an example of what I mean. How does he know reality exists? He just states it. Because he says that what we're observing is not reality. He says, indeed, that the categories or the way our brain is structured, it distorts or creates a mirage for us in terms of what we're seeing. We're not seeing actual reality. We're seeing what our senses and our mind filters that is representative of something maybe in reality. And that, of course, opens up the door to reality doesn't exist, which is what the moderns ultimately come to. I think that's both, absurd and maybe because it comes before Darwin, you could somehow accept that. But if our mind truly didn't give us what is really out there in reality, the human species would not be around today, right? All the evidence suggests that when I pick up a pen and write, it's actually a pen and it actually writes. It's not me imagining, it's not filtering, the pen is not something else. All of my senses are consistent in terms of this. And when the saber-toothed tiger is chasing me, it's a saber-toothed tiger, not a little cat. And if it was a little cat, then I'd be wasting a lot of energy. And if when I saw a cat and it was actually a saber-toothed tiger, I'd be dead because the saber-toothed tiger would have eaten me. So I think that just our experience of reality suggests that reality is there and that we're experiencing it as it is. Now, it doesn't mean that we experience it in every aspect of it, right? So a bat experiences reality differently than we do. But a bat still experiences the same reality, just from a different perspective. It senses it using sound waves, so its experience of it is different, but it's the same reality. That is, if it looks at a cave, I can measure the cave, and the bat, in a sense, will measure the cave, and we will be able to, if the cat could describe it, we will be able to describe exactly the same cave.
Kant would agree with that.
I don't think Kant would agree with that.
Really?
Yes,
so Kant still believes that if I have this cup here, he believes that I'm not experiencing the thing in itself, but that I am having sensations that deliver sense data to my mental apparatus, and that I can make true claims about this mug.
I'm not sure that. I don't think that's true.
Okay.
So I don't think true in this sense means the same thing. I don't think true means that what I'm describing is I'm describing something that really is in reality. It's true in the sense that me and you, because we have the same categorical imperatives or the same structure of the brain, according to Kant. And again, why is that? How do we know we all have the same? Maybe women have it differently than men. Maybe blacks and whites have it differently, and maybe Asians have it differently. So you start breaking it up into identity politics, which is completely Kantian, and we all have different structures of the brain, and we all describe. So when supposedly, right, I'm not arguing this, supposedly when a woman describes the cup, it's a very different cup than when I describe a cup, but we, because we're men, are describing the same cup.
I see your point.
According to Kant, all of us as human beings are describing the same cup. I am claiming that what we're describing is a real cup, and it has that what we're describing about the cup really does exist in reality, and therefore if a bat could talk, a bat that has a completely different structure of the brain, it would describe the same cup as well, because otherwise I couldn't use the cup. I couldn't actually get it, into my mouth and to actually get the liquid. And the bat would keep bumping into it because it could. So if you think about it from a post-evolution perspective, we have evolved to be able to see reality as it is. Otherwise, we would die. And reality as it is the same for us as it is for the bat. We just observe it differently, and we observe different aspects of it because of how our senses work. We have different senses. But the reality is unchanged.
Okay.
And I think that's important because, again, Kant now, once you have this structure of brain and categorical, you can now break it up in different ways. This is how the Nazis can say, well, there's an Aryan way of looking at the world, and we Aryans have a particular brain, and look, our skulls are different than Jewish skulls, and therefore the brains are different, and therefore Jews see the world differently. Jews don't see the world that we Aryans, and therefore they're a different species, and we can wipe them out because they're evil or whatever. Right? I think it's that Kant sets that in motion by saying that our brain dictates the reality that's out there, not just that it's particularly categorical, categories that make that possible. And then, of course, so that's one. That's his epistemology and metaphysics, which I think are wrong. Ultimately, very primacy of consciousness. So our consciousness is in some way creating, filtering, determining what reality is. And look, that comes from a rationalist tradition going back to Descartes. I mean, I think, therefore I am. Not Ayn Rand's flipped that around, right? Ayn Rand's formulation is much more interesting. She says, I am, therefore I think, which is much more what human beings are. I am, what am I? I am a human being, therefore what is characteristic of a human being is thinking. But thinking then takes on a different category. It's about awareness of reality. It's not about playing games in your mind. So I think Kant detaches reality from the mind, even though he doesn't go all the way. His followers take the consequences of what he has established all the way, and it's worse with Hegel, and it's worse then with every iteration forward, all the way to the postmodernists that we have today. And I think they are children of Kant in ways that everybody, in a sense, today in modern philosophy, in one way or another, is a child of Kant. And then morally, of course, this is where he's particularly offensive.
Yeah, so where morally does Ayn Rand stand? So Kant has his categorical imperative, his deontology, and then there's utilitarianism, consequentialism, that has dominated the world. Our democratic policies are our progressive taxation is based on utilitarianism. And then there's virtue ethics. Where does Ayn Rand stand in that sort of tripartite story of ethics?
Well, if you had to do a tripart, then she would be on the virtue ethics part, but that is too superficial to put her just in virtue ethics, because the question for virtue ethics is why? Why these virtues? What's the standard by which we determine the virtues? Where do the virtues come from? And as far as I understand, again, the virtue ethicists don't know exactly how to answer any of those questions. There's not a clear answer. So what Rand asks, she asks a question that I don't think any philosophers have asked in a very long time, probably since the Greeks. What do we need ethics for? What's this field for? And it's to give us a guide for what values to pursue. So what are values? And what makes values possible? What is the context in which human beings need values? And so values are things one acts to gain or keep. Well, why would one act to gain or keep anything? What is it? And she says, well, there's really only one fundamental choice that all living things face, that all living beings face, and that is the choice between life and death, right? And therefore, she says, if you choose life, there's no dictating that you should choose life, but if you choose life, then the question becomes, what value should I pursue to achieve life, right? But you first have to identify this fundamental alternative that we all face as human beings. And then, who should be the beneficiary of these values? Well, I chose life, my life, right? That's where the focal point of values and virtues, virtue ethics should be, is how do I live life? How do I survive? How do I thrive? How do I live as a human, fully as a human being? What are the values and virtues that are going to achieve life, right? If I want death, that's easy, right? But life is hard. Figuring out how to live is complicated. I mean, we still, as scientists, look at other animals and say, how do they live? What do they have to do in order to survive, in order to be successful as a cheetah or as a tree? What are their mechanisms? And that's what science. Well, what she says is ethics is that scientific question applied to human beings. What do human beings need to do in order to achieve life? Now, what makes human beings unique, Ayn Rand says, and again, some philosophers would question this, right, is that we have free will, that we get to choose our values, and that the fundamental mechanism by which human beings survive is by the use of their reason, which for Ayn Rand is the identification of reality. That is the understanding of what is reality. So again, anti-Kantian in a sense, that for us it's the most important thing we can do is figure out what is out there, what is reality, and then integrate those facts and work to help us, to guide us in changing reality, to adapt it to our own means, to our own needs. So all the virtues and values are really derived from this idea of reason, the idea of the fact that reason is our basic means of survival. Man's means of survival is to think. Man's means of survival is to be aware of reality and to think and to integrate it into cognition. So her ethics flows from that. So the virtues, i.e. virtue ethics, come from what are the actions. Virtues are actions. What are the actions? What are the principled actions that human beings must take in order to thrive, in order to flourish as human beings? And so it's an egoistic approach, which some virtue ethicists have. They take that from Aristotle. It's an egoistic approach in terms of I'm the beneficiary of my actions. But it's an approach rooted in reality. This is the is-art that she bridges. The is the nature of man, the nature of the world out there. The art is, what do I do given my nature? Given the nature of reality, what do I need to do in order to survive, to thrive, to flourish as an individual human being?
So the is informs the ought.
Yes. Yeah. So, and the big way in which it informs the ought is reason is the man's basic means of survival. Given the world, given how we've evolved, given what we are as human beings, it is our reason that is distinctive. It is our reason that makes it possible for us to survive in the world.
So how do you respond to thinkers like Jonathan Haidt, who claim that, hey, reason's excellent, it's an excellent tool, but we're not that good at using it. We engage in motivated reasoning. We are tribal creatures. We evolved to be tribal creatures. We engage in confirmation bias, and we're basically circling around sacred totems and then making judgments intuitively and then applying post hoc reasoning on top of that and engaging in confirmation bias to basically justify the things that we already intuitively believe to be true prior to reason. How do you respond to that?
I think it's a combination of things. One, I think it's descriptive, not normative. So yeah, a lot of people behave this way.
That's true.
Does that mean that's how we should behave? Does that mean that is the only way for us to behave? Do we have an option? Second, so one, I think it's descriptive. It's not normative, so it's not ethics in that sense. Ethics is normative. Ethics should tell you this is how you should behave. Second is, I think there's a lot that we don't know that is disguised as evolutionary psychology, which Haidt and Jordan Peterson and Steven Pinker and all these guys advocate for. What are we born with? What aren't we born with? What is free will? I mean, most of these guys reject free will, right? Now, Jordan Peterson doesn't, but he has a weird...
Sam Harris does, though.
Sam Harris does, and Pinker does, right? Steven Pinker rejects free will.
Which I don't understand.
Jonathan Haidt, again, tries to have it both ways. So what are we born with? I mean, Aristotle said we were born tabula rasa. What does that mean? So I still think we're born, and Ayn Rand certainly thought we were born tabula rasa, in the sense of ideas. We can't be socialists at birth. It makes no sense if you understand how, and this is why Ayn Rand's contributions to philosophy are so massive and so important. Ayn Rand has a theory of concepts. She has a theory of how we come at ideas, how we integrate the observations, the perceptions of our senses into concepts, into first level concepts, chair, table, furniture, and then more and more abstract concepts, all the way up to socialism.
Sounds Lockean.
There's a sense in which it's Lockean, although again, I don't know enough about Locke's epistemology. He's a bit of at some point, he's a bit of a mystic, unfortunately, Locke. But again, this is the Enlightenment. This is the age of reason. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are elements of Locke there. But she has a whole theory about how we do this, which I think is fascinating. And one of the great pleasures when I had kids was to watch them form their first concepts and to say, yeah, that's exactly what Ayn Rand wrote about in terms of how human beings do it. And I wish, like child psychologists, like people like Piaget, that Jordan Peterson loves to cite, looked at Ayn Rand's theory of concept and looked at actually how children learn, and they would be blown away, I think, by how much of a genius she was. So I think it's still tragic that we don't have that. So none of these people understand the theory of concepts. So they think we're born with high-level abstractions, which you can't code. You can't code abstractions into the genome. The abstractions are something that have to be abstracted from perception. If you haven't had perception, how can you have an abstraction?
Right, simple sensations, yeah.
Yeah, so you start with sensations, then perceptions, and then abstractions. And only human beings, as far as we know, can abstract. Animals can perceive, but they can't abstract. So if you have that sequence, so they're not capable of separating. So for example, if I ask them, how do you separate between emotion, senses, thought, inclinations, what else? Instinct, what they could call as instinct, and a million other different forms of what it is we're born with, or what it is. They can't even differentiate. They don't have definitions for any of these things. And then they go out and say, we're born with X. They don't know what they're talking about. So I believe that evolutionary psychology is like it's at its infancy. People talk about it as if it's a science, but it's still very, very early. So when Jonathan Haidt says we're born, conservatives are born conservatives, I mean, that's silly. It's yes, people are born with certain inclinations. There's no question about that. Both my sons, from the moment they were born, they were different. So there's something different in them. But it couldn't have been their ideas, right? And it could have been other things, but what are those other things? I don't think the Haidts of the world and others have yet the tools to describe what it really is we're born with and what distinguishes us when we're born with, versus because they don't have the epistemological tools to understand how we develop concepts, how we grow up, how we become adults. So until they develop that, so in other words, I think Jonathan Haidt and all these evolutionary psychologists desperately need Ayn Rand's epistemology. So I encourage them all, if you're listening, to read Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, and to read, the companion to Ayn Rand Studies and the chapters on epistemology. So there's a lot of work that's being done, and I hope will be done, on her theory of concepts, on her epistemology, that I think will help clarify these guys' work in the future. Let me just add one other thing. Reason is hard, in a sense, right? Not hard in a sense that, oh my God, it's painful. No, it's hard in the sense that it requires effort. It requires work. And this is Ayn Rand's unique view of free will. Ayn Rand's view of free will is not that I choose every time I do this, right? Which is Sam have a stupid neurological study that he cites all the time, which has been debunked by lots of different people, but he continues to cite it anyway, right? That every time I do this, I'm actually thinking I should do this, and that's free will. That's silly, right? Free will is fundamentally the choice to focus your mind or not to focus your mind, to stay in touch with reality or not to stay in touch with reality, or in other words, to reason or not to reason, to be or not to be. And she would say to reason or not to reason is to be or not to be, right? It's because the essential activity of being,
right, exactly,
yeah, reasoning, is to be conscious, is to be aware of the world. I think a lot of people, maybe most people, and Haidt would suggest this is true, don't choose to think, don't choose to engage. So what have you got left if you're not thinking, if you're not reasoning? You've got the tribe. You've got your emotion. You're drifting. You're just following what people are saying. You're going along. So yes, the default of reason is all these things Jonathan Haidt describes as the way people behave today. But what are we capable of? Because even Jonathan Haidt, even all of these scientists, they draw nice bell curves. But what about these people out here? What about the people out at the extreme of the bell curve? What about the people who are not tribal? What about the people who are not agreeable? They have these agreeable, the people who don't do everything based on what other people think. Again, think about the fact that we're taught from when we're very little, other people are important. Other people are the most important thing for you. Don't spend too much thinking. Don't too much time thinking. Follow the leader. Who are you? you little twerp. I mean, you're nothing. So, yeah, we train kids to be tribal. We train kids to emote. Today at schools, we put them around in a circle and ask them, what do you think about Donald Trump when they're 6? Well, they don't think about Donald Trump, right? You know, they emote. So you're basically elevating emotion above anything else. No, student when they're 6, when they're 8, when they're 10, when they're 12, when they're 14 even, they should spend time in school learning stuff, not emoting. I don't care about your emotions as a teacher, right? I care about what's in here. Your parents might care about your emotions. Your friends might care about your emotions. I don't care about your emotions as a teacher. And until we get to an educational system that looks to teach rather than to coddle, then we're not going to get the kind of people that I would like, which are independent, truly thinkers. And when we do, Jonathan Haidt's studies would look a lot different. Because, I mean, unfortunately, Adam Smith was the same way. When he talks about ethics, he doesn't talk about it from a normative perspective. He talks about it from a descriptive perspective. This is what people do. Yeah, they're all raised Christians. So they all care about other people more than they should. You know, so then he says, well, there you go, that's ethics. No, that's the ethics of the time, right, dictated by certain ideas that are present at the time, but it doesn't mean that's what is the best in man. That doesn't mean what they're capable of. It's just what they've been taught. And you know, in that sense, too many people, because they don't exert free will, are the products of their environment, and that is sad. So I'd like more people to exert their free will, and Sam Harris, on the one hand, can be an original thinker, can think outside the box, engages his reason. I think Sam Harris is a thinker and is using his free will to think, but then he uses it to deny free will, which is so rationalistic and silly and actually does harm in the world, which is sad. But if more people like Sam Harris in the sense of they were engaged with reality and thinking, then the world would be a better place.
So you brought up education, and I was just reading about the fact that in the social sciences, Marxists outnumber conservatives 4-1. This was a study put out by Musa Al-Gharbi at Heterodox Academy. There was also an extensive study of 8,688 tenure-track professors at 51 of the top-ranked liberal arts colleges in the U.S. This was by the National Association of Scholars, and it found that the ratio of faculty members registered as Democrats compared to Republican is now at 13-1. The researcher here was Mitchell Langbert, and he found that 40% of these colleges had 0 faculty members who were registered Republican, not a single one. Now, I am no Republican, never have been. I'm a libertarian, and I've never voted Republican. But what this data suggests to me is that there's a kind of groupthink, there's a kind of ideological homogeneity, a dogmatic intellectual monoculture, right, going on, dominating the academy, that's not helping us, that is not serving students, that's not introducing students to the full range of human thought. And in fact, Mitchell Langbert actually breaks down this study by discipline. And in communications, I'll just really quickly read it to you by fields. In communications, the ratio is 108-0, no registered Republicans. Anthropology, 56-0. Religion, 70-1. English, 48-1. Sociology, 44-1. Art, 40-1. It goes down and down and down and down. Classics, 27-1. Then you get down to the actual mathy hard sciences and things like that, and it starts to go down. Political science, 8-1. Computer science, 6-1. Physics, 6.2-1. Math, 5-1. Economics, 5.5-1. Chemistry, 5-1. Engineering, 1.6-1. Okay, so
there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? So one is groupthink. I mean, the whole tenure system is rooted in this idea that you promote people you like. You promote people who publish in the journals that you are running, and therefore, and it's true even within these disciplines. Put aside, and even within the discipline itself, put aside politics. It's true that, like, revolutionary papers, articles that are written that really change a field, almost never published in the leading journals.
Right.
So the leading journals in a field tend to publish the things that confirm what everybody already knows.
Of course. And I want to ask you a question about this, though, because and I think what you're saying right now is that there's a lack in the academy of institutionalized disconfirmation, which means if there's no one on the other side to check your biases, then you're going to publish a lot of biased work. So based on all of that, that long-winded list of showing how lopsided the academy is. What do you think Ayn Rand or objectivists would say about the current climate in academia, this ever-increasing tilt, especially in the humanities and social sciences, towards a kind of left-wing, anti-reason, anti-science, moral and epistemological relativism, this adoption of a kind of postmodern worldview grounded in critical theory, feminist criticism, post-structuralism, intersectionality, ethnic and identity studies programs, all of this. In other words, how can we use objectivism to combat what's going on in the universities, to bring a little bit of sanity back? Or at least, what would objectivists say about the tools we could use to combat identity politics, neo-Marxism, and other illiberal philosophies dominating the academy?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. But I mean, I'll start with this. Look, I mean, this is a huge problem in academia. There's no question about it. I also don't want to exaggerate it, though, because I think it can be exaggerated. There are people who identify as the left who are still good professors who teach good stuff. I mean, you know, as much as Steven Pinker is wrong on a lot of things, and he's leftist, and he's wrong on free will.
He's brilliant.
He's brilliant, and I'm sure his classes are pretty interesting. And I'm not sure adding a standard conservative, you know, is what is, and that, so the flip side of that is, I'm not sure conservatives are what you need in academia, right? Yeah, I mean, the fact that it's all one, so homogeneous, is problematic and disturbing. But it's also true that to some extent conservatives are pricing themselves or keeping themselves out of academia. One is because they don't go into some of these fields. My guess is they're just not interested. Second is, look, I don't know. If you don't believe in evolution, I can't take you that seriously. And you want to be an anthropologist, but you don't believe in evolution, or you want to be I don't know, any field almost, and you don't believe in evolution?
I've never met a conservative, a mainstream, intellectual, intelligent, studied, evidence-based conservative that doesn't believe in evolution. And my thought is,
plenty of them. I mean, look at this whole think tank in Washington State dedicated to creationism, and you know, they've got a scientific name for it now. But
well, that's unfortunate. But there should be.
Yeah.
You would assume that if there wasn't,
think about why Silicon Valley doesn't vote for president, right? If you're Silicon Valley, why doesn't vote Republican for president? If you're in Silicon Valley, you've dedicated yourself to technology and science, and then the stupid presidential candidates, when they do the debate, not one of them will acknowledge that evolution is real. I mean, how can you vote? I mean, I'm not justifying them voting for Bernie Sanders, but how can you vote for a human being who pretends to be intelligent, who is going to be president of the United States, who says, at best, I'm not going to comment on the question of evolution. You know, it's so primitive and barbaric that it has no place on the thing. Now, it's true religion has no place in politics, but this isn't about religion. This is about their courage, but it's also about their respect for science and the fact that they don't. So I think some conservatives disqualify themselves from academia because they're not serious.
Some are kept out.
Some are kept out. There's no question. So the bias is there, and there's no question the bias is there. But it's also true that I don't think conservatives are the solution, because the conservatives, of course, are either mystics of some form or Kantians or something else. I think the solution is some fresh thinking about everything, not just about politics. And I don't like that we define everything in terms of political agendas. But if you looked at philosophy department, how many of them are Kantian? 70% or something.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah, that will always be even more if you look at the fundamental concepts, that there's no diversity even there, and bringing in conservatives doesn't solve that. So what objectivism is hopeful of, that we start diversifying those kind of ideas by bringing in people who will challenge the Kantians, in some of the humanities who will challenge the postmodernists, who will of course, identity politics. Of course, the way to challenge identity politics is to be an advocate of individualism, and it's not to change tribes, which is unfortunately what many on the right do, right? Oh no, your tribe definitions are no good. Let me give you my tribal definitions. But no, to abandon all tribal definitions for the sake of a real philosophical individualism. And that, to me, is what's lacking in academia. What's lacking in academia, and I think, unfortunately, conservatives and libertarians haven't picked up this mantle, but this is the mantle they need to pick up, is philosophical individualism as a counter to everything the left represents, both in politics and in kind of identity politics, which is not really politics, which is more epistemology and more ethics. It's a real form of tribalism. So I would like to see us be more philosophical and focus in on the root causes. So, for example, we need to defend free will. We need to defend individualism, and the individual is the beneficiary of his own actions, because only then can you defend capitalism. If you shouldn't be morally the beneficiary of your own product, your own actions, redistribution of wealth is fine. Coercion is great because it achieves a moral purpose. The moral purpose is more equality in society. This is my book, Equal is Unfair, right? If the goal is, if you don't own your stuff, this is why I think the most important speech Barack Obama ever made was one of his more philosophical speeches, was that you didn't build that speech, which he stole from Elizabeth Warren, who might be our next president. There's a scary thought.
Yes, but we did pay the people who did build that a fair market wage.
Exactly, and that's my book explains all of that and why you are the beneficiary of these things. But he gave the speech, you didn't build that, and people made fun of it, but they didn't critique it. There was very little actual critique, because the fact is the conservatives don't have a critique of it, because morally they believe in redistribution. Morally they believe that your purpose of your life is to serve others. They just want to tinker with it a little differently than the left does. So what is needed is a critique of the idea of altruism, the idea of egalitarianism, not just of its political manifestation, but of its philosophical roots. And again, that's what we do in Equal is Unfair. That's why I think this is one of the biggest issues of our time, this whole egalitarian idea, which with the next presidential, as the left, we'll see what happens to the left, but which is a leftist idea, which the right never challenges really. But you didn't build that is rooted. I mean, almost every academic I know believes that to some extent or another, particularly academics who've never been in the business world. Of course, they don't believe it applies to them, right? When you ask them, does that mean the article you wrote you didn't write? Oh, no, we're special. But they believe it, and that's what needs to be challenged. It's those fundamental ideas in epistemology and ethics. The politics will take care of itself if we can get that, and that's where we need the diversity of ideas. And at the Institute, the Ayn Rand Institute, we've been trying for years, and it's hard, to train people to be academics, to go into these universities, to help them out with dissertation grants and help them out in university positions to create that diversity. But the left is so dominant, we need so many people. It's going to take a long time, and the world is crumbling in the meantime philosophically.
Yeah. Great. So I want to address your book, Equal is Unfair. Your book really does a nice job busting a lot of these inequality myths. You go after, for example, this idea that a lot of people have that wealth is a zero-sum game. It's a fixed pie. When you listen to folks like Bernie Sanders discuss income inequality, he speaks as if there is some fixed amount of money, this giant grab bag of cash in the center of the country just lying around, and that when someone gets rich, it's because they've taken too much of the money in the bag, and that this taking comes at the expense of others. Why is this wrong?
Well, I think it's important to note that President Trump does exactly the same thing.
Of course.
Exactly the same thing.
When he talks about
trade. So this is not,
don't get me started.
So it's the left and right problem, although it's not clear where Trump is on the left or on the right.
Bernie Sanders was just the first to come to mind.
No, Trump does the same thing when he says the Chinese are winning, we're losing. It's complete and utter ignorance of economics. The mistake is that the mistake is multiple, right? The pie is constantly growing. Wealth is constantly growing. And I'll say why I hate the pie analogy in a minute. But wealth, and you know that because you live, right? You know that because you look around the world. Yes, the Chinese are richer, but so are we. And people all over the world are richer today, and there's massive amounts of wealth in the world that didn't exist 50 years ago, certainly 300 years ago. All of us were poor. Yep. And we didn't exploit aliens to get to where we are today. So where did this wealth come from? The wealth comes from the human mind. This goes back to my original point about it all starts in the human mind. We change our environment to fit our needs, and when we do that, We create something that didn't exist before. We build a house. We create agriculture. We change the world around us to fit our needs, and therefore for us, and there is nobody else as far as we know, for us, that is wealth creation, right? The environmentalists now say we've exploited the earth. Yes. So in that sense, it's at the expense of the atoms. We've restructured the atoms in new ways. But there's no value in the atoms other than our ability to restructure them. So the wealth is created, it's observable. And of course, I don't like the pie analogy because there's no such thing as a social pie. There's no such thing as a collective wealth. Each one of us creates the wealth. Each one of us does build it. We do create the wealth for ourselves. We each contribute to this global pie something, but that something we contribute is ours, and the global pie wouldn't exist if not for the contributions of individuals. So they each own their own little pie. It's an abstraction that economists do that lump all the pies together and make it into one big pie. So, but take trade with China. It's true, China benefits. The worker in China, the company in China, is benefiting because we're buying something they made. And they are selling it at a price that gives them a profit. But why are we buying it? We're buying it because it makes our life better. We're buying it because it's cheaper, so we have more money to spend on other things. So it's raising our standard of living. So the Chinese are better off, and we are better off. Now, maybe under some circumstances, they are better off more than we are better off. Under other circumstances, it might be the reverse. It's almost impossible to measure those things. But who cares? We're both better off. And, you know, who's better off when I buy an iPhone, right? Me or Apple? I think me, by far.
Both.
They make, well, we're both better off, but who's better off more, right? I think I am, by far, right? They make a profit of 50%. My iPhone is worth, I've never really run the calculation, but somewhere in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to me. Of course, don't tell Apple, so they don't raise my price. But that's what it's worth in terms of its enhancement of my quality of life, my ability to do things on the road, my ability to chat with my family by video from far. I mean, what's that worth to anybody? It's worth huge amounts. Now, Apple, of course, buys its finished product. It assembles it in China. So what's the relationship there? Who's better? I mean, you can't do the calculation. It's impossible to do. What we know is it's a win-win relationship. We know that because we can observe it. Because I wouldn't enter into the trade if it was otherwise. If Chinese products were garbage, and if they weren't worth their price, I wouldn't buy them.
Right, it's voluntary. What's immoral about that? It's voluntary, yeah.
It's voluntary. Now, sometimes you buy a lemon. Sometimes you lose from a trade. But then you don't repeat it. And you don't. You try to avoid lemons as much as you can. That's why we have consumer report guides. That's why we have Amazon ratings. That's why we do these things in order to avoid lemons. And if in spite of all that, we still are buying stuff from China, it means that the stuff we're buying from China makes our life better. And economists who've looked at this would argue that it's made Americans' lives much better, not a little bit, but a huge amount better. I would actually argue that a lot of the increase in the standard of living of Americans since the 80s is a consequence of really two things: technology and China. China representing world trade, right? So trade globally, because those two things have driven costs so far down that we don't know how to measure it exactly as economists, and that they have improved our life by so much that, again, we don't know how do you measure as an economist the value an iPhone actually has for people.
Right.
No, you can't do it. What economists, I think, call consumer surplus. I don't like that term, but consumer surplus. We don't measure it, but that's the real value that's being created. That's what we can't measure. So standard of living of Americans is dramatically higher because of China and because of technology. Two things that people love to bitch about and complain about and denounce. So
what do you make of arguments that people like Jordan Peterson make when he claims that, look, hey, a bit of inequality is fine, of course, but when the inequality gets too extreme, when there are too many people stacked up at the bottom, that is when societies become destabilized. What do you make of that argument?
I ask him to give me an example. And the fact is that the only example they always go, the French Revolution. Yeah, but the French Revolution was a king. It was an unfree society. So yes, If you stack it up like that in an unfree society, you will get a revolution. But there was no revolution in 19th century America. There was no revolution in Hong Kong. There's no revolution in modern America. I don't see social unrest. I actually don't see the workers of America united against the rich. Yeah, there was, but to the extent that it exists because of bad philosophical ideas, not because of economic realities. We're not economic determinists. I thought Jordan Peterson was not a Marxist, but I think Jordan's very confused about these issues, and I've told him so. And then he goes to this is his bizarre argument, but again, it's kind of an evolutionary psychology argument. Well, there's 10% of the population has an IQ below some number that even the U.S. Army won't have them.
80 or something like that.
They're not competent of doing anything. And therefore, what do you do about those people? And that has nothing to do with inequality. So let's assume you have to do something with those people, and therefore we create a big charity to help them out because they really can't. But I was in the Army. I saw really, really, really dumb people. I mean, really low IQ people. They can drive a tank. I've seen them do it in the Israeli army. I was in Chicago recently, and I'm sitting in an office in a Haidt tower, and I see across in the window, I see these guys cleaning windows on like the 50th story of a building, and they're sitting on this little thing cleaning the window. And I'm like, I probably got a higher IQ than they have. You couldn't pay me enough. You $10 million, and I'm not getting on that thing
right.
to clean those windows, right? So, and now Jordan would say, Elon Musk would say, well, one day we'll have robots doing it, sure. But there will always be jobs for manual laborers. We'll always come up with something that people will do with their hands that does not require that big of an IQ. And I will add this, computers make us smarter. Even people with low IQ are smarter because of computers. One day, I could imagine that not only robots are going to get smarter, but human beings will get smarter. Why? Because we'll be able to plant a chip in somebody's mind and have him be able to do certain tasks independent of his IQ, because he'll be relying on the computing power of the computer, and he'll be providing whatever it is that we can provide as human beings to do the work. So I am not as pessimistic about technology, about the human race, and about low IQ people. I mean, the women at the nail salon don't have to have a high IQ. And then, I mean, I don't know where you live, but if you live in California, every strip mall has at least one nail salon. There are literally tens of thousands, mostly East Asians, working at these nail salons. I don't care about IQ, so I've never thought about what's the IQ of these women, but I can tell you it doesn't take a high IQ to do the work that they're doing. So I don't see massive unemployment among so-called low IQ people. I just don't see the issue. I think it's an issue we make up. I think in this case, it's an issue Jordan Peterson has made up because he knows all these stats, and he consulted with the U.S. Army once, and they told him about they're not hiring these people with low IQ, and he thinks, they couldn't work in my job. Yeah, they couldn't be a psychologist, but really, there are no jobs where a low IQ person can make a living. It's just not true, I would say.
So I want to end this discussion by sharing a quote from your book with my listeners that comes early on in the book, and I want to get your reaction to it. And once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this podcast. It's been great talking to you. And so I'm going to skip a sentence here, and it starts with freedom. Freedom drew millions of immigrants to our shores. And then you cite an 1850 poster, an advertisement calling for Irish immigrants. The poster says, quote, "In the United States, labor is there the first condition of life, and industry is the lot of all men. In the remote parts of America, an industrious youth may follow any occupation without being looked down upon or sustain loss of character, and he may rationally expect to raise himself in the world by his labor. In America, a man's success must altogether rest with himself. It will depend on his industry, sobriety, diligence, and virtue. And if he do not succeed in 9 cases out of 10, the cause of the failure is to be found in the deficiencies of his own character. So I do love that quote, but the first thing that struck me when I read it was that we would never advertise this message today. I can't think of a modern day politician or political candidate, right or left, or anywhere in between, who's ever run on a message like this, probably because they wouldn't get elected. But we don't broadcast this philosophy, even though it seems to be of a piece with the ideals of this country. What has changed?
Well, philosophy. So free will, you don't have free will. So 9 out of 10 people, right, who fail, it's their fault. You can't say that today. Oh my God, you're dismissing the poor. It's the it's racism that causes them to be poor. Not to dismiss that racism exists and it's a causal factor, but it's something else. You can't. You didn't build that. And I think conservatives agree to some extent that you didn't build that. So it's the tribe. Nobody runs on that placard because we believe now in egalitarianism. We don't believe in effort. We don't believe in personal responsibility. We don't believe in reason. We don't believe in effort. We don't believe in fundamentally free will. And what's changed is philosophy, whether it's John Rawls. We haven't talked about John Rawls, probably the most influential modern, American philosopher of the last 30, 40 years since his book in the 1970s, who argued that we don't. It's genes and it's our environment. That's it. And therefore, we should all be basically equal, or we should be unequal only to the extent that we help everybody else. And therefore, redistribution is great. It's fine. It's virtuous as a consequence of that. So people like Rawls have killed that poster. But of course, it goes back to the progressives during that same period of time who were coming to America from Germany and bringing Kantian philosophy, bringing these ideas of socialism and bringing these ideas of egalitarianism, the lack of free will. All of those ideas were coming into the country in the late 19th century, undercutting the fundamental basic principles on which the country was founded. And today, all those ideas are dogma. They're just accepted by everybody. I mean, imagine a poster like that. Imagine a political agenda like that. Oh my God, that would be so much fun. That would be so much fun. Just the language. Think of how sophisticated the language is in that poster. And most Americans would go, what? I don't even understand what he's talking about, unfortunately. So, 19th century was something. The mid-19th century was a unique era in all of human history. There's never been, I believe, a more exciting, more thrilling, more advanced civilization, if you take civilization in all its different dimensions, than the 19th century. Great art, great science, great engineering, great business, and a massive increase in the quality and standard of life. And we still benefit from a lot of that, but in diminished form.
Absolutely. And one thing I forgot to ask you is that I wanted to see if you could come up with a few books that you would recommend my listeners, but also young people generally who are interested in your ideas. I wonder if you could recommend a few books. It could even be a book.
First, I would start with all of Ayn Rand's books. I think too many people read Atlas Shrugged and that's it. But I would highly recommend Atlas Shrugged. But then, of course, all the nonfiction, including Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. If you're really interested in philosophy, if you're interested in epistemology, it's a beautiful book with really simple but profound and deep explanations for how it is that how the human mind works, things that nobody in academia today understands and accepts, unfortunately. So I would read Ayn Rand. I would read a lot of the literature around Ayn Rand. There's a great book called The Companion to Ayn Rand Studies, particularly for people interested in academia and interested in applying Ayn Rand's ideas in an academic philosophical context. That is a fantastic book.
Is that Peikoff?
No, that's actually Greg Salamieri and Alan Godhelf, the late Alan Godhelf, edited it, and it's a series of essays. And then, of course, Leonard Peikoff's works, from Ominous Parallels to Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, which is the one systematic presentation of the entire philosophy. So OPA, we call it, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, is the best book presentation of Ayn Rand's ideas. And then he has a more recent book called DIM, the DIM Hypothesis, a kind of a study of history and how to explain history from how philosophy causes history, which is a theme in a lot of Leonard Peikoff's work. And a lot of the people affiliated with the institutes. I have 3 books now. one called Free Market Revolution, which is how Ayn Rand's ideas can end big governments. It's an application of Ayn Rand's philosophy to the realm of politics. I have Equal is Unfair, which you mentioned. All these books are available on Amazon. And then I just published a book on the morality of finance, which takes me back to my years as a finance professor. So all those books are available on Amazon and elsewhere. So I'd say if you want to really understand Ayn Rand, read Ayn Rand and then read people at the periphery of the Ayn Rand Institute, of the movements, who really studied with Rand, like Peikoff.
Anything outside of Ayn Rand in terms of economic theory or?
Sure. I mean, if you're interested in economic theory, I mean, Mises, I think, is the greatest economist ever. Don't read Mises.org. Read von Mises, the actual person. Human Action and his book on socialism and everything he wrote is brilliant. Anything in the tradition of the Austrians, particularly the older stuff, is excellent. Some of Hayek's economics is good, although I don't like his political theory. And there's a lot of material coming out from Austrian economists. I mentioned George Selgin or Larry White, who do a lot of interesting work on free banking. I mean, I've enjoyed, so that's on economics. I've enjoyed Steven Pinker's books. Particularly, I just finished reading Enlightenment Now, which I thought was fascinating. I liked his book about violence, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I think it's called. So I read a lot. But problem is I can't retain anything. Nothing. The names don't pop in. But I read a lot of the stuff that's out there, and I find a lot of it quite interesting and quite fascinating. So if you're curious and interested, there's a lot of stuff to read. But when it comes to philosophy, unfortunately, it's Ayn Rand and some of the people who studied Ayn Rand who provide the most value, and there are not a lot of them. But I would definitely recommend reading all of them.
Okay, thank you for those recommendations, and I want to again thank you for being on this program. You're one of my personal heroes, and I really appreciate your time and your graciousness. So
my pleasure. This was fun. Thanks, Jordan.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, awesome. Always interesting, enlightening, and all of that to talk to an objectivist. I am, full disclosure, not an objectivist. I don't agree with everything they put forth, but I do appreciate anyone that does take a principled stance for liberty, freedom, justice, and limited government. And speaking of that, let's now transition into a brand new segment that we will continue to do most episodes moving forward here on the Western Canon Podcast. And that segment is what I call the Liberty Lounge. The Liberty Lounge will be, in some ways, a book review segment where we will explore the great ideas of American and Western thought in general. And of course, the idea here is to select great books that focus on the topic of liberty and freedom. The idea here, if things go well, is to do both older texts like John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, maybe some Locke, maybe some Hume, some Burke, some Hayek, Friedman, Robert Nozick, that sort of thing. And then newer texts like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now or Jonah Goldberg's Suicide of the West. We'll probably do that book after the one that we're doing now. And that, I think, will yield for us both a broad and diverse conversation about liberty, freedom, and justice. So the idea here is to examine every little corner and really get down to the nitty-gritty as we talk about the principles that undergird freedom and liberty. Okay, so here we go. In episode 1 of the Liberty Lounge, we're going to focus on Thomas G. West's fantastic new book, The Political Theory of the American Founding, Natural Rights, Public Policy, and the Moral Conditions of Freedom. This is the perfect book for this segment because that's really what we're trying to get down to, is the question of where do natural rights come from? How can public policy secure liberty and freedom for individuals, and what are the moral conditions of freedom. And that's a topic that I'm very much interested in. So let's start with the introduction to the book. Thomas G. West is a Hillsdale College professor, and he writes in the introduction to his book that his aim really is to lay out the, quote, principles and policies that help to set in motion the beginnings of a great nation. West says right at the outset that his task, quote, has something in common with archaeology, digging up old bones, but that these bones, quote, are of interest today because they claim to be living principles based on timeless truths. West explains that his project in this book is to fully understand and articulate the American founders' political thought. Current scholars, he writes, make the claim that their thought is, quote, best understood as an amalgam of liberalism, that would be classical liberalism, republicanism, meaning democratic republicanism, and perhaps other traditions as well. In this book, West attempts to redefine this understanding, and he makes the argument, quote, that the founders' consensus documents point to natural rights and the laws of nature as the lens through which politics is understood. West goes on to say that the founders did rely on other traditions like common law and Protestantism, but only to the extent that they helped to secure the natural rights that I mentioned. The author then goes on to outline the contents of his book, which takes readers through the main parts of the founders' political theory. So I'm going to start by introducing the structure of this book here, and then we'll jump into Chapter 1. So Chapter 1 of the book is about the meaning of equality, natural rights, and the laws of nature. We'll be examining Chapter 1 today. Chapter 2 is about how our founding ideology was not just a, quote, amalgam of conflicting traditions, but rather that the founding ideology is typified by a focus on, quote, the central role of natural rights. Chapter 3 discusses typical misunderstandings of equality and natural rights. Chapter 4 dives into the rational basis of the founders' principles. Chapter 5 defends the idea of the Lockean state of nature as something real and not hypothetical. Chapter 6 deals with the multiple meanings of the, quote, consent of the governed. Chapter 7 details how government secures natural rights in domestic and foreign policy. So the next thing is that West then sets out and clarifies his central argument. The founders, he says, and this is a quote from the book, the founders, quote, rejected the idea of an individualistic autonomous self with rights and no duties. Rather, they held legal protections of liberty and promotion of citizen virtue to be two aspects of the same political theory. Both are indispensable. Government deters threats to natural rights in a couple of ways. One, by raising armed forces to repel or deter external aggression. Two, by enforcing criminal laws protecting person and property against injury from fellow citizens. Three, by defining property ownership. And 4, by enforcing contracts in courts of law. And then on top of that, and this is really the subject of Chapter 8 of the book, government then, quote, encourages the people to respect and fight for the natural rights of fellow citizens by promoting appropriate moral conduct, including devotion to the common good, because the founders were, quote, confident that without public respect for the most important citizen virtues, a free society would not last. So without a social fabric and without virtue, freedom is one generation away from dying. Chapters 9 through 13 of West's book show how government requires, or encourages probably is the better word, encourages people to perform their moral duties. Chapter 9 details how the government promotes civic virtue through laws. Chapter 10 looks at laws concerning marriage and family. Chapter 11 looks at how government shapes public opinion through teaching and example. And chapters 12 and 13 look at specific moral qualities that are worth promoting. That is, virtues of assertiveness, such as courage, prudence, and vigilance, along with virtues of self-restraint, such as justice, moderation, and frugality. So everything I've listed belongs to parts 1 and 2 of the book. Part 3 finishes out the book by looking at property and economics. So that would be chapters 14 through 18. So chapter 14 looks at property rights. 15 looks at how we define and protect private ownership. 16 explains the legal framework that we use to secure market freedoms. And 17 discusses the founders' approach to ensuring that money has a stable value. And finally, the last chapter, chapter 18, explores the often mythologized Hamilton-Jefferson quarrel of the 1790s with respect to federal economic policy. What I think makes West's book unique, as West himself points out in the introduction, is that in writing the book, he doesn't rely very much on letters, journal entries, conversations, anecdotes, church sermons, or any other secondhand accounts, but rather West relies on the actual founding documents. So the book that I'm reviewing for you here actually details how the founders' philosophy emerges out of these documents and details the thinking that goes into these documents. Essentially, the book is looking at how the many important documents actually express a philosophy that is binding and that represents a genuine consensus, a thoroughly considered endpoint fortified by debate and marked by a process of heterodoxy. Okay, so let's jump into chapter 1 of the book. Chapter 1 is called Equality, Natural Rights, and Laws of Nature. In chapter 1, West starts out by explaining that the natural rights doctrine, especially those concepts of equality, the laws of nature, the social compact basis of government, this doctrine is the core of the founders' political theory. So chapter 1 gives a brief account of the politics leading up to the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, the stamp tax, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and things like that. But West also traces the birth and rise of a growing discussion in America about liberty, starting all the way back in 1717 with a book by Massachusetts minister John Wise called A Vindication of the Government of New England Churches, which described what Wise called, quote, the principle of equality in a natural state. There was also a 1725 book by Connecticut minister John Buckley that represented the first American overview of John Locke's political theory, along with Alicia Williams's treatise Pleading Religious Toleration, which discussed Locke extensively. Eventually, and this is according to Alice Baldwin, quote, every church-going New Englander long before 1763 was familiar with the doctrines of natural right, the social contract, and the right of resistance. In this discussion, the author, West, is really offering proof that, in many ways, it was the people's knowledge of this theory of natural rights, along with what he calls a, quote, restless colonial impulse for freedom that drove the Americans to an increasingly spirited insistence on their right to live under laws made by their own representatives. In the end, writes Jack Rakove, independence emerged as a logical conclusion flowing from principles that most delegates shared, and as a response to events that they could neither control nor evade. Now at this point, West turns to the actual political theory of natural rights that I'm going to cover in detail, and he first acknowledges that the founders obviously were not able to create a government fully in accordance with their principles. The most obvious example of this is slavery. West starts with the Declaration of Independence in this chapter, since it's America's original official founding document, which Congress formally approved to justify the break with Britain. And here West starts with a famous line, all men are created equal, which West argues has been one of the most misinterpreted and least understood of the founding ideals. What does equality mean? Does it mean equality of rights, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome? West argues that, quote, equality means primarily not ruled by another, free from the domination of others, equally free and independent. And these are some definitions from the book. To be more specific, West claims that the meaning of equality can be found in the theory of natural rights. This is why the line in the Declaration of Independence goes, quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So the Declaration gives us a definition of what equal means. By all men are created equal, the founders mean that all men are created with and share certain, quote, natural, essential, and unalienable rights. And that quote actually was from the Massachusetts Bill of Rights. So the Declaration of Independence establishes an equality of rights. And these rights are inalienable. meaning that they exist in civil society, outside of civil society, before government, and after government. Our rights, according to the founders, are not given to us by government. They don't come from government. They come from God or nature. This idea of natural, inalienable rights was strong and widely held at the time. The Declaration of Independence calls them inalienable, but the Virginia Bill of Rights calls them, quote, inherent, while the Massachusetts Bill of Rights calls them, quote, natural. In fact, the Pennsylvania, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Ohio Bills of Rights combine all three, calling them, quote, natural, inherent, and inalienable. Another codified version of this idea of natural rights can be found in the Georgia Resolutions of 1774, which states the, quote, indelible rights of mankind, and in the Virginia Bill of Rights, where it is the, quote, indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible. So this demonstrates that the idea of natural rights that pre-exist and outlast government, rights that the government can't touch, was really ubiquitous at the time. And it wasn't just a slogan or a word. Different states and deliberative bodies were desperate to find the right words to concretize the idea that all laws and all governing structures had to conform to certain pre-existing, inviolable rights, and that in fact the purpose of government was to defend and secure these rights. The whole purpose of government is to defend and secure these rights. Now, what are these rights, and how should we understand them? Here West quotes Philip Hamburger, who writes, quote, 18th century Americans tended to discuss their natural rights as portions of their natural liberty, as portions of the general freedom of individuals in the state of nature. The freedom of individuals in the absence of government was what Americans generically described as, quote, life, liberty, and property, or, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote. So the terms property and pursuit of happiness are interchangeable here in the sense that in order to pursue happiness, property rights are required. To quote the author, when the government takes your property without your consent, it thereby takes away your liberty to use your talents to acquire the property you need for life and happiness. In the leading documents of the time, writes West, the most frequently mentioned rights were, quote, life, liberty, property, religious liberty, and seeking and obtaining happiness, unquote. Other important rights mentioned frequently were, quote, reputation, keeping and bearing arms, freedom of speech and press, and assembly, unquote. Okay, so let's unpack these natural rights to life, liberty, and property, since this set of rights is the most influential, the most cited, and possibly the most misunderstood today. And we're especially going to look at the logic of how these are natural rights, rights that follow from man's existence in a state of nature, because that's something teachers get a lot of questions about. How can rights be natural? How does that work? How do you have rights without government? How come government doesn't give you your rights? How could that be possible? Okay, so here I'm going to quote West on page 28. Again, this is from chapter 1. West writes, quote, if all are born free and equal, and if no one is entitled to take that freedom away, that means everyone is rightfully free of the violence of others. Murder being the worst kind of violence, life is the first or most urgent natural right. Expressed in the law of nature language that the founders sometimes used, quote, the law of self-preservation is the first law of nature. The right to life, along with all other natural rights, includes the right to self-defense, if necessary by using force to resist force. So that's life, and the idea here is that your right to life generally means that you have a right to live free from force, violence, and harm. You have a right to defend your life, and if you cannot do so, the government's whole purpose is to put structures in place, police, SWAT, FBI, CIA, even firefighters, to protect your life. But remember, all of the rights codified by the Constitution and discussed in the Declaration of Independence, these are all individual rights. So when it says in the Declaration of Independence that it is the right of the people to do X, just know that what is always being referred to are individual rights. So yes, your right to life even means that you have the right to personally defend yourself, your family, your property. And that's why the Second Amendment is so important. So this is straight out of Locke, and it's kind of important to know. When a government forms, right? When a government is formed, you do not give up the right to self-defense to the government. Yes, Locke agreed with Hobbes that it was the government's job to protect you, but that's just because the government can organize better. But you do not give up your personal right to self-preservation, your right to defend yourself when a government is formed. You don't outsource that right. That right cannot be outsourced. It's inalienable. It is the right to life, liberty, and property, or pursuit of happiness. Why? Well, because the Founding Fathers understood that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and while the government's sole purpose is to protect your rights, by force if necessary, it cannot be everywhere at once. And remember, its job is also to protect your right to personally protect your own rights. Okay, so that's life. And now liberty. Liberty, according to West, means, quote, being left alone, not being coerced by others. Being born free, all may do as they please without interference from other people, subject only to the laws of nature. Liberty in daily life, therefore, means that people are free to organize their affairs as they see fit. But this freedom, and here West is referring to the First Amendment and freedom of speech, this freedom is not limited to religious associations. Liberty includes the right of any self-selected group to converse together, to assemble, and to govern itself according to its own voluntary rules for any other non-injurious purpose. So the First Amendment covers a lot of ground, really. I'll read it here just as a reminder. And here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so the First Amendment covers a few things. 1, freedom of religion, and to practice your religion, whatever that religion may be. 2, freedom of speech in general, which includes 3, freedom of the press, 4, freedom of association, the quote, right of the people to peaceably assemble, and 5, the freedom to criticize, make a complaint to, or seek the assistance of one's government without fear of punishment or reprisals. So in other words, freedom to petition the government. Notice that all of the liberties enumerated in the Bill of Rights are negative liberties. They are negative rights, and the Constitution in general is a negative document. By that, I don't mean that it is a moody or pessimistic document. Negative rights are the rights you have against interference in your life, liberty, and property. So negative rights represent your freedom from being messed with. They are rights against. They are rights that you have against, well, what? Against a government that would seek to violate your liberty or coerce you or harm you, against other people that would do violence to you or violate your liberties, and against really any foreign or domestic threat that would impede your liberty. So negative rights are rights that require others to abstain from interfering with your actions, with your pursuit of happiness. Again, all of the rights in the Bill of Rights are negative rights. Notice the First Amendment, how it begins. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. See the emphasis on Congress shall not. Or the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These are negative rights. All of the rights in the Bill of Rights are negative rights. So we have a unique basis of freedom in this country that no other country that I know of has, in the sense that it is a codified set of negative rights that it is the primary job of the government to protect. This is why the Constitution is often described as the rule that governs our rulers, the law that governs our lawmakers. In many places throughout the world, a nation's founding document or constitutional document will lay out rules that the people must follow, right? They tell the people what they can and can't do. Our document puts limits on our government. It limits the power of our government. It tells the government what it can't do. Now, this is to be differentiated from positive rights. Positive rights, as opposed to negative rights, are what Bernie Sanders is talking about when he says that healthcare and college tuition and daycare and food and retirement money and a basic income are rights. Positive rights, which quite frankly we should get out of the habit of calling them rights because they're really just privileges, commodities, and or services. Positive rights, so-called, require others to provide you with either a good or a service. Let me help to make this distinction clear. The Second Amendment, as it's written, states essentially that because citizens need to be able to form militias and defend themselves, the government won't infringe upon the right to bear arms. That is a negative right. It essentially says that if you wish to own a firearm, we won't try to stop you, so long as you're not mentally ill or you don't have a history of violent crime. We won't stop you, but you still have to enter the free market, prove that you're a law-abiding citizen with a sound mind, and pay for it yourself by the fruits of your labor. If the Second Amendment were a positive right, that would mean that the government would have the obligation to furnish every American with a firearm, but that's ludicrous. So the Second Amendment is a negative right. Nobody can stop you from purchasing a firearm. According to most libertarians, and I suppose folks who would call themselves constitutional originalists or conservatives, positive rights should not exist until they're created by a contract. And that's because positive rights are really rights to other people's labor. And nobody has a right to your labor or your services. At least that's how it is supposed to work in a free country. So of course, someone has a positive right to your services if you have consented, if you have created a contract where there's a mutually consensual transaction that takes place. I'm going to give you this, you'll give me this in return, and everything's consensual. Wikipedia defines negative rights in the following way. To take an example involving two parties in a court of law, Adrian has a negative right to X against Clay if and only if Clay is prohibited from acting upon Adrian in some way regarding X. In contrast, Adrian has a positive right to X against Clay if and only if Clay is obliged to act upon Adrian in some way regarding X. A case in point, if Adrian has a negative right to life against Clay, then Clay is required to refrain from killing Adrian. While if Adrian has a positive right to life against Clay, then Clay is required to act as necessary to preserve the life of Adrian. Now let me make something clear. It is the case that sometimes positive rights are necessary to secure these fundamental negative rights. For example, take the 6th and 7th Amendments to the Constitution, which give citizens the right to a fair trial administered by an impartial judge and jury, and that if an individual can't afford representation, the state has to provide that service. Now, this mandatory service is undoubtedly a positive right. Again, you have the right to the services of a lawyer if you can't afford one. And yet it's important to remember two things about this service. One, the service is not the right. The service in this case, the counsel of an energetic lawyer that works on your behalf, the jury, etc., protects the right. But the right itself is not the lawyer or the jury. The right, that is, the negative right that the lawyer protects, is the right not to have your liberties violated through an unfair trial. And we can only ensure that this right is protected by offering the service of a fair trial. In order to protect your negative rights to life, liberty, and property, the government, in a sense, ensures that these services are provided. One way to think of this, and most of the Founding Fathers would likely have agreed with this, one way to think of this is that positive rights should be guaranteed only insofar as they serve to directly protect negative liberties. And so again, when you have a guy announcing all of a sudden that healthcare is a right, this just isn't true technically, at least not according to our constitutional structure and our common law system. This is because nobody has a fundamental right to the services, commodities, or labor of anyone else. That's called slavery. Why is it slavery, you might ask? Because your labor is your time, and your time is your money, and your money is your property. And so when the state gets rid of the free market and collectivizes an industry, doctors, say, no longer have the right to their own labor. They no longer get to set the terms and conditions of their labor, and they no longer get to set the price of their labor, nor does the market get to set the price of the commodities they sell. This destroys incentives, leads to scarcity and long wait lines, and discourages innovation. To take this a step further, as libertarians often like to point out, even taxation is technically slavery. I typically don't go that far. In other words, if the government takes 50% of a doctor's income, that means that the state is by definition taking 50% of her labor, and thus 50% of her time. And therefore, she technically spends 50% of her day working for the state for free on threat of force. Why on threat of force, you ask? Well, that's because the state has a monopoly on force, and any attempt to shirk the taxes they impose will in time result in punishment. First in fines, then if you don't pay the fines, in arrest, and then of course imprisonment. So notice that we've met all of the necessary requirements of slavery here. So back to the First Amendment, because we got a little bit off track there, but all of that was a way to swing back around and discuss how deep and fundamental the First Amendment really is to our everyday lives and to West's account here of liberty. According to West, quote, "Liberty in daily life means that people are free to organize their affairs as they see fit, and that, quote, no one may disrupt a free association because of disapproval of its purpose, unless that purpose is to harm the equal rights of others." In the founding, it was taken for granted that an employer and an employee generally have a natural right to exchange money for labor on any mutually agreeable terms, and that private clubs and schools may establish any criteria of membership they like. And so you can see how this flies in the face of attempts by government to nationalize, if you will, or centralize entire industries. Right? That would go against the Constitution. Paraphrasing Madison in Federalist 10, West writes, quote, "To take away the right to form private associations, clubs, businesses, private schools, churches, and so on, in the name of eliminating selfishness, bigotry, or superstition would mean the end of liberty," unquote. And so here finally we get to West's view of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the point of this bill being to outlaw discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, a very noble aim. West seems to agree with the premises of this 1964 bill, quoting Linda Chavez, who writes that, quote, "The principles contained in our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, took nearly 200 years to find their fulfillment in the Civil Rights Act," unquote. However, West does make a note that Chavez's words are not true when it comes to Title VII, which stipulates that even private employers are not free to discriminate on the basis of any of the aforementioned factors like race, sex, or religion. West writes, quote, "There is no evidence that the founders would have approved of government-mandated non-discrimination in privately owned businesses, to say nothing of affirmative action. The idea here is that private businesses should be free to discriminate, even if we happen to strenuously disagree, as I do, with their bigoted, discriminatory behavior, because to rule otherwise would clearly be to violate the First Amendment's protection of freedom of association. In other words, a Jewish baker should not have to bake a cake for a Nazi celebration, in the same way that a female baker should have the right to deny service to a Hasidic Jewish man for what she deems to be his religion's oppressive treatment of women, in the same way that a Christian baker should have the right to refuse anyone in the case of having to make a certain type of cake for a certain type of celebration. Now, as someone who has no problem with gay marriage, I have the right then to protest outside the baker's shop, which I might, if there were a baker, an intolerant baker in town, I might do that. I have the right to never patronize his store. I have the right to protest outside of his store. I have the right to recommend to all of my friends that they go to the bakery across the street and flood this intolerant bigot's Yelp reviews with negative comments. So I have the right to see such a baker as a bigot and as a fool, and I have a right to announce my opinion to the world, right? We can work together to put this guy out of business. However, I do not have the right to tell him who he is and isn't allowed to associate with. Title II of the Civil Rights Act seems to be a sensible exception to this, in that it outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, and all other public accommodations engaged in interstate commerce. And that makes sense because there should be a mandated equal access to all public accommodations engaged in interstate commerce, which the government has the constitutional authority to regulate. The government can, according to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the government can regulate things like interstate commerce, And so really West argues that it's only Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that he views as unconstitutional, even if most Americans agree that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a generally positive thing. Right. So we've covered West's summation of life and liberty, and now we turn to property, what the Massachusetts Bill of Rights calls the right of, quote, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. Thomas Jefferson's substitution of the phrase pursuit of happiness for property in the Declaration of Independence was an intentional and calculated move, according to West. There are two major reasons that Locke said life, liberty, and property, while Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness. First of all, Jefferson, who according to West, quote, constantly affirms the natural right to property in the strongest terms again and again. Jefferson knew that in order to pursue happiness, property rights were essential. In the same way that freedom of speech requires a functioning brain and the ability to wield language, though brains and language are not specifically referred to in the First Amendment, so too does the pursuit of happiness require, as Jefferson puts it, quote, the equal right of every citizen in his person and property and in their management. In order to pursue happiness, according to Jefferson, one had to have the, quote, free exercise of one's industry and the fruits acquired by it, unquote. Or as Madison puts it in Federalist 10, there is a, quote, diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate, unquote. These faculties, according to West, include, quote, ambition, intelligence, experience, and strength, which, quote, lead people into different jobs and professions, and they partly explain why people acquire different amounts of wealth, unquote. In other words, says West, quote, when government takes your property without your consent, it thereby takes away your liberty to use your talents to acquire the property you need for life and happiness, unquote. And vice versa. That goes both ways. Besides the Declaration of Independence, writes West, 8 early state constitutions and constitutional amendments proposed by 2 other states speak of a right to pursue happiness. If you look at New Hampshire's Bill of Rights, this right is almost like an umbrella under which all of the other rights are contained. The claim that this right contains all of the other important rights, and therefore is actually the most important, is also bolstered by another important facet of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence insists that when government becomes destructive of these ends, that would be the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government, to engage in revolution. When the Declaration of Independence says this, and I'm quoting West here, it, quote, takes safety and happiness to be the sum of government's purpose. According to West, safety refers to life, liberty, and property, ensuring that those things aren't violated, while happiness is the goal of human life, which can't be accomplished without the former. This doesn't mean that government's job is to determine what happiness means for citizens and then to force them to live in a certain way. I'll quote West here on this point of whether government should hold citizens' hands, leading them towards some state-approved utilitarian version of happiness. West says, quote, that was arguably Plato's logic and Aristotle's, but the founders followed Locke and other modern philosophers in turning away from this kind of politics. Rather, they thought that the best way to promote public happiness was to secure these rights, i.e., to limit the design and end of government to freedom and security, as Thomas Paine phrased it in Common Sense. Government's primary duty, then, is to protect citizens against predatory violence or other interference with their liberty, whether from fellow citizens or from foreign attack. At this point, after life, liberty, and property, the author establishes a fourth natural right that, while certainly covered under the Declaration's conception of liberty, definitely deserves its own explication, and that is religious liberty, which the New Hampshire Bill of Rights refers to as each individual's, quote, natural and inalienable right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of his own conscience and reason. The Maryland Declaration of Rights gives easily the fullest and fiercest articulation of this right, insisting, quote, no person ought by any law to be molested in his person or estate on account of his religious persuasion or profession, or for his religious practice. The founders' conception of religious liberty, according to West, had 2 main elements. First, that all may worship in the way that they think best, and second, that they are permitted to follow what they believe to be God's will in their daily life outside church. Okay, so now let's talk about rights and duties, the second to last topic in this section of the book. West begins this section by reminding readers that the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence shows that, quote, rights and duties go together. And this, of course, was a very important part of the philosophy of the founders. Jefferson's declaration begins, quote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So, the first section of, some would argue, our most important founding document reminds us that so long as we are to assume among the powers of the earth the, quote, equal station to which the laws of nature, I should point out that the words laws and nature are both capitalized here, that insofar as we have these natural rights, mankind is required to, quote, declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, mankind has a duty, and every right comes with its own attendant duty. West puts it in another way, framing the sentence in terms of the duty Britain had then, once we had declared our independence, the duty to respect our rights. Here's West referring to the Declaration of Independence. America has a right to national independence, but that means that Britain has a corresponding duty not to trespass on the separate and equal station of other nations. Indeed, if you scale that down to the natural liberties that we as Americans have against the government and against one another, you can think of this in local terms. We as individuals have a right to independence and liberty, but that means that other citizens, other individuals, have the corresponding duty not to trespass on the, quote, separate and equal station of other citizens. I've always appreciated the famous quote, which I'd always thought was said by John Stuart Mill, but is apparently attributed to the legal philosopher Zechariah Chafee Jr., when he said in 1919 in the Harvard Law Review, speaking of a man who was arrested for punching another man in the face, quote, the man who was arrested asked the judge if he did not have a right to swing his arms in a free country. Your right to swing your arms ends just where the other man's nose begins. And so that quote is often attributed to John Stuart Mill, who may have repeated it in his own writings, the idea that you have a right to swing your arms, but that right ends where the other man's nose begins. And I think that's a good metaphor. The lesson here, that's a good analogy. The lesson here is that your duty begins where the other man's nose appears. West does a great job in this section of the book defending the founders' philosophy against thinkers like Patrick Deneen, Wilson Carey McWilliams, and surprisingly Alan Bloom, who each strawman the founding fathers, arguing essentially that the Lockean natural liberties they sought to defend were simply, and I'm quoting McWilliams here, quote, but a tyranny in which I am the tyrant able to command the bodies and resources of others to live as I like. West says that this common misunderstanding of the founders' philosophy is an approach that thinks of freedom as, quote, all rights and no duties. But for the founders, duties were inseparable from rights. Here West cites Washington's first inaugural address, in which he insists that, quote, there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage. And so lastly for this segment, I just want to bring up West's discussion of how the Founding Fathers viewed the laws of nature. That would be laws with a capital L and nature with a capital N. The founding documents that we have, according to West, recognize the laws of nature as the, quote, ground of natural rights. And by natural rights, West essentially here means negative rights, quote, the assertion of our rights against others. West cites the Stamp Act of 1765, in which the Massachusetts Assembly resolved that, quote, there are essential rights which are founded in the law of God and nature and are the common rights of mankind, and that, quote, no law of society can, consistent with the law of God and nature, divest the people of those rights. I personally like the Georgia Constitution of 1777. West also cites this one, which refers to the, quote, common rights of mankind, which Americans are, quote, entitled to by the laws of nature and reason. So our natural rights are secured by what we would be able to reasonably do in a state of nature. Now, all of this certainly flows out of that Kantian, Lockean, deontological tradition of natural rights and categorical duties. This is a process-based system insisting that civilization regard the individual and his or her natural liberties as sovereign, versus the utilitarian tradition, which sees justice as not a question of protecting individual liberty, but rather of preferred material outcomes. Here with utilitarianism, justice isn't a matter of process. It's not a matter of protecting negative liberties so that the individual has the freedom to pursue what she believes will make her happy. No, instead, justice in the utilitarian philosophy is about the distribution of positive rights, of goods, of services, of commodities, the distribution of those things to everyone, resulting in what Bentham called the greatest good for the greatest number. Under utilitarianism, the concern is not fairness of process or individual rights. The concern is that the greatest number of people, the majority, the group, the herd, should get the outcome that they deem pleasurable. Utilitarianism distributes utilities, and if you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, then so be it. Jefferson agreed with Locke and believed the opposite, stating in his 1774 writings that a, quote, free people claiming their rights is derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. Okay, so that is a summary of the arguments made in Thomas G. West's excellent book, The Political Theory of the American Founding. We covered the introduction and we covered chapter 1 in this segment. In the next section of the Liberty Lounge, I'll go into depth with the middle and latter chapters of Thomas G. West's book, and we'll go into depth on the topics of liberty, natural rights, equality, and others. We'll talk about the foundation of natural rights, i.e., where do they come from? We'll talk about John Locke and Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, and we'll talk about social compacts, contracts, and consent. And we'll also discuss virtue and property rights. And I'm looking forward to it. So we'll see you next time. So that's it for episode 8 of the Western Canon Podcast. I'd like to thank Gina Santiago and Dr. Yaron Brook for joining us on this episode. In the meantime, happy reading. We'll see you next time.